Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chris Rodman, a research fellow at Sasakawa, USA, and I'll be your master of ceremonies today. My role today is to make sure you have all the administrative information you need and also to keep us on time. So I'm going to keep it very short. First, as I said a few minutes ago, if you haven't yet picked up simultaneous interpretation headsets and you need them, please do so. They're on your right over here. One of our first speakers intends to give his remarks entirely in Japanese, so again, unless you're functional in both languages, you might want to pick those up. When you see, they're marked for English, I believe, on the left and Japanese on the right, but either way, English is on channel 2 and Japanese is on channel 10. Also, Wi-Fi instructions. The hotel does offer free Wi-Fi in this room. I think all of your seats had a little business card with the Wi-Fi password, but the password is lowercase SPF, as in Sasakawa Peace Foundation 2019. That's SPF 2019. We will be live tweeting our entire event today on Twitter, so you can follow us at US-Japan Security. Let me get that, make sure I got that right. Yeah, I'm sorry, hashtag US-Japan Security. Also, we'll be live streaming the event in both English and Japanese and recording the event. So if you can't stay for the whole day and you still want to follow us later, you could live stream it or you could watch it later. I do want to recognize our very diverse audience. We have distinguished guests from many fields here today, but we also have a number of undergraduate and grad students and folks from different embassies and several cultures, and I want to encourage everyone during the Q&A periods to ask questions. Please don't be intimidated, and please ask questions no matter how old or young or experienced you are. I'd like to say a couple things about the fire exits. The 3 doors to your right are the primary way out of this room, and in fact the only way out of this room. And once you get out in the hall, you can go left or right. The shortest distance would be go out in the hall, turn left, and go out the main exit. And also the restrooms, go out into the hall, turn right, go down to the end of the hall. You'll see a Sasakawa USA banner, which is our overflow room. And there are restrooms back in there, and you'll see the signs. Okay, so first I'd like to welcome our CEO of Sasakawa USA, Ambassador James Zumwalt, to the stage for introductory remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here. We really appreciate your coming today to the 6th Sasakawa USA Annual Security Forum. With the conclusion of the U.S.-Japan Security Consultative Committee last Friday, with the upcoming visit of Prime Minister Abe to Washington and the President Trump's plan to visit Japan in May, I think it is safe to say we have never seen such an intense period of high-level U.S.-Japan meetings as we will see in the next, in this couple of month period. So I think it's very appropriate today to really focus on U.S.-Japan security relations. We have an exciting agenda. We'll be focusing this morning first on the Indo-Pacific region and exploring ways in which the United States and Japan can work together to enhance our shared objectives, which were laid out very well, I thought, in the 2+2 statement last Friday. And then our afternoon sessions will be exploring how Japan's new National Defense Program guidelines present new opportunities for the United States to enhance its collaboration with Japan. And if you haven't done so, I'd urge you to pick up outside on our publication table. There's a good book that was just published this week on with American and Japanese experts looking at this topic in more detail. And then finally, our second to last session will be on Japanese social changes and how that has an impact on Japan's own security. And finally, the last session will be a conversation between me and an American and Japanese government official talking about how our two governments see our security relationship. If I could briefly make a comment about Sasakawa USA, for those of you who are not yet familiar with us, we're a US-based organization dedicated to strengthening US-Japan relations. We do this through educational programs like this one, through research and also through social media. So please do, if you're interested in our research, stop by our publication table out in the hallway and see various things that we've put out about US-Japan Security Alliance. And if you're interested in our social media, please follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, and you can get some continuing flow of information about US-Japan issues. But now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Sugiyama. He has a long history of service to his country, and if I explained everything he's done so far, we would run out of time. So I would encourage you to turn to page 15 of the program, where you can see his biography, and I'm not going to go into detail about that here. But I did want to tell you one story about Ambassador Sugiyama that illustrates, I think, the close ties between the United States and Japan. Everyone who was living in eastern Japan or in the Tokyo area remembers where they were exactly when the Great East Japan earthquake struck on March 11. I remember in vivid detail what happened because I was sitting across the table from Ambassador Sugiyama. We were at the Foreign Ministry Guest House. 2011 was a period of very intense coordination between the U.S. and Japan on North Korea. And several times a week I would call his office and ask to come see him because we had an urgent message or some issue to discuss. And he was always very accessible and always agreed to see me. But we were sitting across the table and suddenly on the second floor of the guest house, and suddenly the building started shaking violently. We could hear the building creaking, the lamp was swinging, and both of us, when you live in Japan, you get a lot of civil defense training, and you're taught, go under a table. That's the safest place to be during an earthquake. So we sort of forgot about North Korea. We both crawled under this table. And I remember thinking, I'm so glad the Foreign Ministry invested in a very sturdy table. It was a really solid oak table, and I was very glad for that. But the earthquake went on for about 5 minutes. It just kept going and going and going. And so right away, both of us peered across from under the table at each other. We knew that this was a very severe problem. But also the glances we exchanged, I think we, without saying so, both of us thought the same thing, which is that the United States and Japan are in this together. We're going to pull through and we're going to work together to overcome this crisis. So it was a moment for me that really illustrated the close friendship and the close relationship that the United States and Japan enjoy as allies, that we were able to connect sort of without even speaking to each other at this very trying moment for Japan. So Ambassador Sugiyama has been a tremendous friend of the United States, and for that reason, it gives me great pleasure to ask him to come up on the stage and give us some welcoming remarks to open our security conference. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, Ambassador Zumwalt, thank you for your very sort of nice and personal introduction about myself. It is true that if my memory is correct, that was 2 p.m. 58 or something, very close to 3 p.m. We are consulting something to do with the DPRK, or things about the security of our region and the U.S.-Japan Security Cooperation, something. And all of a sudden, March 11 just got started. As Ambassador Zumwalt was rightly saying that, of course, we have whole bunches of unforgettable, very sort of, fine memories of sort of discussions between you and myself and or others. But that's one of the really, really unforgettable moment because of the following two disasters. But by the way, about which I think everybody should be reminded of the fact that it was the U.S. forces and the U.S. people who helped us a lot under the banner of Tomodachi Cooperation something. By the way, as I was telling some of you yesterday, internal kind of informal dinner, I'm always sort of feeling very good and comfortable to be with people like you who are doing security aspect of the bilateral relations, not only limited to bilateral relations, but the Indo-Pacific or even international community, than those who are doing something else. This morning, with this huge crowd and something, not necessarily presumably off the record session, I don't say who they are, but these are people who are dealing with the securities matters. Somebody whom I feel all the time very comfortable, since we seem to be based upon the same kind of objectives and if not identical, but very certainly clearly similar policy directions. Admiral Blair, Ambassador Zumwalt, and then General Oriki, Vice Minister Nishi, Dr. Hundabashi, friends new and old, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I welcome my chance any chance to discuss the peace and security, and particularly this morning. I am delighted to be here, and I am delighted you, most of you are my old friends, and some are new, but you are here today, this discussion place. Last week, as Ambassador Zuma rightly pointed out, I accompanied the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Minister to the 2+2 meeting of the Japan-US Security Consultative Committee. When you include the American side, not many, but half a dozen something, and me, and with my colleagues, this actually adds up to more than 2+2, but who is counting? The discussions at the 2+2 meeting were exactly the same as presumably, well, if not identical, but quite close to the theme of today's forum. And that is the new security challenges of the US-Japan alliance. The security environment surrounding Japan and the United States of America, particularly in the East Asia theater, ought to be expanded to Asia-Pacific, and these days to be expanded to Indo-Pacific region, has become increasingly uncertain in recent years, with obvious reasons. As we have seen changes of power in the area, great forces are at work, and I believe that the eventual history of these things will reflect that. The question is whether history will show that our alliance responded. In the 2+ meeting, we welcomed the alignment of the strategy policy documents of the both countries, namely the United Nations National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, and Japan's National Defense Program guidelines. These documents share so many points that one could wonder which document was a copy of the other. Of course, this is a slight exaggerations, but I think if you take a look at these certain fundamental documents which were done quite recently, you can tell that the fundamental kind of directions of the security policies of the United States of America and of Japan seems to me, if not totally identical, but very close in nature. These strategies show that the US-Japan security partnership continues to adapt to be stronger, more advanced, and more effective. The question is, now is how we can implement these strategies into actions. One remarkable aspect of the increasing strength of our alliance shown recently is a new operation cooperation demonstrated in November of 2017, when North Korea was inflaming regional tensions. That time, that deepened alliance under the new 2015 US-Japan Defense Guideline and the groundbreaking peace and security legislation enabled Japan's helicopter destroyer Ise to participate in a joint exercise in the Sea of Japan with 3 US aircraft carrier task forces, the Ronald Reagan, the Theodore Roosevelt, and the Nimitz. This was flotilla, democracy, peace, and security. It clearly shows a new era of operational capabilities and cooperation and contributions to safeguarding the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Along with the deepening bilateral cooperation, we are restructuring SDF posture responding to changing security environment. Just recently, April the 7th, Japan created the Miyako Area Security Force in Japan's southern western island. This and other new camps on southern western islands are one of the symbols of a new SDF posture adapted to a new security environment. and demonstrate our determination to defend Japan by ourselves, including these smaller islands. We do not want these islands to be to feel they are alone, and will further restructure SDF posture with the deployment of guided missiles units in these islands. You know, we are talking about the changing interpretation to a certain degree about the Article 9 to include some of the not only individual self-defense right exercises, but to newly include changing the interpretation of the Article 9, some of the collective self-defense rights being given by Chapter 51 of the United Nations Charters. But not in full, but in its actuality, this is something to do with the defense of Japan. But that is widely reported, but I think it is at the same time very important that we try to do more to defend ourselves, our islands, main 4 islands and the small islands by ourselves. Of course, in conjunction with the cooperation with the United States powers under Article 5 or Article 6 or whatever of the U.S.-Japan security arrangements. But I think I would like to put an emphasis upon that it is Japan's government which is doing something further to defend us together with the United States of America. Of course, naturally, great, as I said, and rapid, and then fundamentally and in a sense historically unprecedented changes taking place in our region. Maybe not only in East Asia, but elsewhere too, in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. But I think I can claim that my area or the theater in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific is one of the conspicuously changing and unprecedented changing with reason. I'm not going to book down into details about who are doing what. I think I'm going to just leave you to discuss in the entire today about these sort of things included. Finally, under the well-aligned strategies, the alliance is expanding even beyond innovative operational cooperation between vessels and U.S. aircraft carriers. That is bilateral cooperation in the new domains of space, cyberspace, and electromagnetic spectrum. Capabilities in these areas, utilizing these capabilities in any integral way will define the battle in the future. Well, I would say, I said in the future, but presumably it already gotten started. If we don't do anything now, I'm sure it is going to be too late. That's one of the things which the two ministers from each side, discussed to a certain length. It's been led by the American side, but I think our side is following that particular sort of area of discussion and areas of operation and areas of cooperation very rapidly. I think my government, including SDF, seems to have come to be fully aware of the necessity of doing that together with the United States of America. And then this should be one of the focal points in these days of U.S.-Japan security cooperation. As new threats develop, bilateral cooperation in cross-domain operations is a key to effective deterrence and response capabilities in the future, or, as I said, not only in the future, but now, and from now on growing. So, in closing, I'm very happy to welcome you to this forum, and I'm very grateful for your commitment to the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region, and even sometimes beyond. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ambassador Sugiyama. Next, we'd like to play a short video message from Ambassador Bill Hagerty, U.S. Ambassador to Japan.
Hello, I'm Bill Hagerty, U.S. Ambassador to Japan. Congratulations to Sasakawa, USA, on hosting the 6th Annual Sasakawa, USA Security Forum. This forum is an important opportunity to share best practices and to discuss new ways to further the U.S.-Japan alliance. My friends Ambassador Zumwalt and Chairman Dennis Blair both have a long history of great work in Japan and the United States, and I know they've worked hard to bring you together today. Over the past 2 decades, Sasakawa has played an integral role facilitating dialogue among policy leaders within Japan, the United States, and the rest of the world. It is a leading contributor of ideas and thoughtful policy recommendations to make the world a safer and more prosperous place. Through this forum and other efforts, I am certain that Sasakawa will continue its great work to strengthen even further the rock-solid relationship between the United States and Japan. I commend Sasakawa USA and you, the participants, who are instrumental in these efforts. Although I can't be with you in person today, I wish you the greatest success with your event and look forward to hearing your ideas. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, General Ryuichi Oriki. We've already heard where Ambassador Zumwalt and Ambassador Sugiyama were on 3/11, and the man who was the head of the Chief of Staff of the Self-Defense Force is our speaker this morning. He had been the chief of the Ground Self-Defense Force after a distinguished career in the Ground Self-Defense Force, and then became the Chief of Defense Staff. He directed the Self-Defense Forces in their response to that unprecedented disaster. I don't think any of us will forget the images of helicopters flying over Fukushima, Army, Ground Self-Defense Force helicopters with brave soldiers surveying, fighting the disaster there. The teams of Self-Defense Force personnel who went out from Sendai through the region, surveying damage, recovering survivors, helping to do the sad task of gathering the bodies. It was a signal moment for the self-defense forces. I can also say as an American that General Oriki was a strong proponent of the U.S. cooperation with Japan and the Japan Self-Defense Forces during that time. We all look back and say that it was a great example of U.S.-Japan cooperation, but there was a lot of bumping and grinding, tough issues, and hard work in order to make that cooperation happen for the common goal. And General Oriki was key in keeping that cooperation on track, learning as we went along, and ensuring that the U.S. contribution to the relief efforts was done in the right way and in cooperation. Since that time, General Oriki has become a respected voice and a more public voice within Japan for the growing, important, and responsible role for the self-defense forces within Japan. We are all aware of the difficult legacy of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy from the Great War, and it's been a long time for the self-defense forces of Japan to work their way back to the sort of respected and important role in society that they deserve to play. And General Ariki has been a major voice in retirement in making that role happen. And he is a type of former leader so respected by the Japanese public that he can lead that effort. And I think it's very important for U.S.-Japan relations. Following General Ariki's remarks, he and I will have a conversation based on these common topics that we have. And I would very much like to welcome General Ariki for our keynote address.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, but I will speak in English today. That was a truly wonderful introduction that I'm honored to receive. The fact that I'm able to stand here today, I remember the wonderful support that I received while I was in the self-defense forces. Ever since the Great Japan earthquake, it's been 8 years. Since I retired, it's been 8 years, and I have thought that people have paid attention what hasn't been done in the past 8 years, and I'm a little bit nervous to think about it. But it's wonderful to have so many people within the audience. And Admiral Blair and some others, I really appreciate their support. At the same time, I only have about 20 minutes, and so I'd like to read the speech that I have prepared here. Next week, in Japan, we will have a large event. The current emperor will abdicate on April 30th, and the crown prince will become emperor on May 1st. The Heisei era will end. That's what it's called in Japan, and that will end. And a new era called the Reiwa will begin. It's been 74 years since the Second World War ended. And we've had 3 eras, Showa, Heisei, and Reiwa now. And the beginning of each of these eras happened to coincide with great changes in international affairs. Of course, the start of Showa marked the beginning of the Cold War, and the start of Heisei marked the beginning of the post-Cold War. And now, with the beginning of Reiwa, we are once again facing the possibility of a great change in the existing international order. Around 2010, things began to change drastically on the global change towards the new era. There are many factors that contributed to this change, including rapid globalization and the increase in information, the rise of China's economy and military, the change in the U.S. administration's political beliefs and tactics. Within that, the change in the security environment in East Asia is especially prominent. And thanks to globalization, the United States, the existing hegemon, and China, which is rapidly rising in power, are increasingly interdependent in areas that include politics and diplomacy, military, economy, and technology. The two countries are in competition of state versus state. That is different from the state versus state conflict during the Cold War or the state versus non-state conflict during the post-Cold War. And so this is a truly complicated competition that is going on right now. The United States has named the rising China and Russia as strategic threats that threaten its global hegemony. And it has considered it a first priority to deal with those, not terrorism, but actually insecurity, to deal with this competition among global powers. And this is the beginning of a competition between great powers, between the revival of the great Chinese people that President Xi Jinping wants and the America First that President Trump wants. And within the many factors, the rise of China is the biggest, and I'd like to discuss a little bit more about that. China's GDP, as you know, surpassed Japan's in 2010. In 2017, it was approximately 2.5 times Japan's GDP and is now the second biggest economy in the world. According to the 2019 China Security Report that Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies published this past February, the Xi administration's strategy in changing the international order has two pillars. First, using its economic power, that is the second largest in the world, China will develop its economy further, play a leading role in the region, and help form the international order. Second, using its rapidly expanding military power, China will handle what it considers core interests, the issues of sovereignty, as well as territorial and maritime disputes. So China intends to create and take advantage of a gray area that's neither real peacetime nor wartime. One of the strategies for this is the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to expand China's sphere of power and create a new international order. In terms of military power, this is already visible in China's continuous activities around Japan's Senkaku Islands, its construction of military bases in the South China Sea, despite the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and its attempt to even limit U.S. military activities. China's 2019 military budget was announced at the National People's Congress last month as 20 trillion yen. This is an increase of 2.5 times what it was a decade ago, and 4 times Japan's defense budget. China's military continues to lack transparency, and on top of strengthening their nuclear and missile power, as well as maritime and air forces, they're also expanding in new areas like space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. It can be said that they've surpassed the realm of anti-access area denial A2AD. Even within Japan, the Chinese maritime and air forces remain active. Naval vessels now regularly pass the Southwest Islands and come into the Western Pacific Ocean. China's first aircraft carrier, Liaoning, is also expanding its activities into the Pacific Ocean. It is even rumored that China's second aircraft carrier will soon be in commission. China's fighter jets and bombers are also active. To be specific about this, the number of scrambles by the Japan Air Self-Defense Force has surpassed its peak during the Cold War. In 1984, it was 944 times. In 2016, the number of scrambles was 1,168, of which about 70% was against Chinese aircrafts. In 2017, 6 H-6 bombers from China flew near the Kii Peninsula, which is to the south of Osaka. Until recently, there was little concern for military threats against metropolises with big Japanese populations or seats of political or economic power near the Pacific Ocean. In the future, or currently, these factors must also be considered. China has the goal of modernizing its military by 2025, as well as making its military one of the strongest in the world. Therefore, these military activities might further accelerate in the future. And so we need to recognize that this is an urgent problem. Regarding the Korean Peninsula, last year we had the very first US DPRK summit, and again this past February, but there hasn't been any concrete progress. In fact, by March, there were reports that North Korea is continuing nuclear development. Since North Korea's greatest goal is to maintain power, the possibility of it completely abandoning nuclear development is very low. That is also my opinion. In any case, North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities remain essentially the same and continue to be a threat to the international community, as well as a significant threat to Japan. In March, there were also reports that the U.S. and South Korea agreed to end their joint military exercises. This is an issue between those two countries, but in general, it is possible that their level of skill would deteriorate, their military pressure on North Korea would wane, and their deterrent capabilities would weaken. If, in addition to that, the denuclearization in North Korea shows no progress, the military power balance in the Korean Peninsula and Asia as a whole might be disrupted. We may even face a terrible situation in the future. And in that sense, the U.S. and Japan must continue to work together in close coordination.
And I'd like to move on to another topic, which is regarding Russia. Russian President Putin described that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he currently pursues to revive Russia as a strong nation in coordination with China. And in the Asia-Pacific region, Russia's eastern shift has become more prominent, and Putin is attempting to increase Russia's presence by cooperating with China. Russia continues its negotiations on the northern territories with Japan while announcing the surface-to-air missile deployment on Japan's northern territories, in addition to repurposing a commercial airport to dual use and deployment of Su-35 fighter jets on Etrov. And these are indications of Russia's stronger interest in military activities. Southern Asia tends to attract more attention, but I suggest that we should not lack attention to Northern Asia as well. And when we look at these new environments, maybe this is not quite new, but I'd like to rethink the strategic values that Japan poses. So when we look at this geopolitical and also strategic values, the Japanese archipelago, in geopolitical terms, it is a massive hurdle for China to expand into the Pacific Ocean. The southwestern islands hold significant values, and China has normalized its passage by vessels and also aircrafts in the area. To counter China's activities, Japan's self-defense has increased its defense capability in the southwestern islands in recent years. To put our efforts in scale, the total length of the southwestern island chain is 750 miles, but there were no deployments of the GSDF southern to the main island of Okinawa, meaning that this left the southern 370 miles of island chain unprotected or a security vacuum. Since 3 years ago, in 2016, the Coastal Observation Unit has been deployed in Yonaguni, which is 60 miles from Taiwan. In March, the GSDF launched new security and missile camps on Amami and Miyako Islands. Also, work to build a camp on Ishigaki Island was also recently started. And with these recent developments, we're seeing a massive expansion of the ground self-defense forces. These enhancements will support warning, surveillance, and scramble activities by the MSDF and an ASDF in the South and East China Seas as dynamic deterrence. And also the GSDF deployment in the southwestern island chain creates a seamless wall as a static deterrence to multiply the effects of our defense. And I am certain that Japan's geopolitical and strategic values have increased in the context of the U.S. strategy in Asia. With all the backgrounds mentioned, Japan created a new iteration of the National Defense Program Guidelines last December. Since its previous version 5 years ago, Japan's security environment has been rapidly changing. And as I touched on some of the examples today, and the current NDPG adapts to those challenges. This iteration of the NDPG is a first in a sense that the Japan's NSC, which was established 6 years ago, led the revision for the first time. In the revision process, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Chief Cabinet Secretary, Ministers of Foreign Affairs, and Defense gathered in the so-called Four Ministers meetings for countless discussions. And the NDPG focuses on space, cyber, and also electromagnetic domains, as Ambassador Sugiyama mentioned in his remarks. The expansion to the new domains beyond the conventional ground, maritime, and air domains shows our awareness to fundamentally change the definition of our national security. For that purpose, space and cyber special units will be newly created. With the new domains, Japan states a clear direction, departing from conventional defense to strengthening prevention capabilities for the first time. I understand that this is a pivot to a breakthrough. These domains were identified as the priority areas for the U.S.-Japan alliance during the 2+2 committee last week. During the 2+2 meeting, to mention a few, the two countries affirmed that applicability of Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty to cyber attacks and agreed on the opportunity to host U.S.-provided SSA payloads on Japan's quasi-Zenith satellite systems. Simultaneously, Japan and the United States must significantly renew our views on not only on organizations and assets, but also our views on strategy and deterrence in order to deepen our strategic consultations and to address the new domains. Japan's activities are still in the first phase, but all capabilities over all domains, including ground, maritime, and air, will be organically integrated to construct flexible and strategic defense forces in the future. Of course, there are many challenges for Japan to take future steps. Since 2004, Japan's defense budget saw a downward trend for more than 10 years. And it's been steadily growing under the Abe administration. This budgetary uptick needs continuous support moving forward. And also, Japan's low birth rate poses a challenge in human resources. There's also an operational challenge. The challenge is to enhance Japan's self-defense forces' joint operation capabilities. In March 2018, the JGSD launched the Ground Component Command over 5 armies. With the launch, the ground, maritime, and air defense forces respectively have their own centralized commands, and enhancing joint operation capabilities remain as a challenge. And regarding Japan's self-defense's operations, Chief of Staff centralized advisory role to the Defense Minister has been fully integrated, and its capability has been enhanced. However, the enhanced role is still an advisory function to the minister. Looking to the future, stronger joint operations within the JSD and practical joint operations between Japan and the U.S. require a holistic JSD commander who would truly be the Japanese counterpart to the U.S. Indo-Pacific commander and a permanent joint HQ. So this is critical to successful joint operations with the United States. I strongly advocate for establishing a permanent joint HQ from my experience as the Chief of Staff who received the U.S. Operation Tomodachi 8 years ago after the Great East Japan earthquake. Because there's an afternoon session on the NDPG today, I'd like to wrap up my comments on the guidelines. To conclude my speech, I would like to emphasize that, as Ambassador Sugiyama mentioned, the strengthening security cooperation with the United States and other allies is essential. However, Japan should play a primary role to protect our own country. With that assumption given, we must strive to share further mutual understanding. And to that end, our countries must strive sharing situational awareness by, for example, the utilization of the ACM proposed in the 2015 U.S.-Japan Defense Guidelines and BPM from peacetime. With such efforts, the two countries can see enhanced practical capabilities. Militarily speaking, collaboration in space and cyber, and also the deployment of the latest F-35As will take place, followed by the Global Hawk deployment in spring of 2020 to Misawa. And to further strengthen the Japan-US jointness in soft power and hard power, Aegis Ashore systems for BMD and also other equipment will also be deployed. From policy to execution, from central to front lines, I hope we see consistent and also growing relations between Japan and the United States in all aspects. So my speech might have been something that you had already heard before, but I just wanted to tell you that we are trying to play a primary role in defense, and also we are adapting as quickly as possible to the changing environment. And so those are critical points for Japan to grow into this defense area. And for that purpose, I would like your feedback and also guidance in the future. Thank you so much for taking this time.
May have heard some of the things that you told us, but we have not heard them in such a coherent and authoritative way, so thank you very much. I think it's important for both Americans and Japanese to understand that this new competition, deterrence with China is different from the Cold War. Some of the military aspects of deterrence are the same. We need to maintain our individual capabilities. We need to strengthen our integrated, combined capability. But you and I served in the self-defense forces and the armed forces during the Cold War, and this is a very different situation. Right now, there is a naval review going on in Qingdao, and there's a Japanese ship there as part of it. Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing at the end of last year. Americans and Chinese are negotiating in many, many areas, and yet we have this underlying Chinese military buildup, and unless it is countered, then it puts our countries at a grave disadvantage. So how do we put the military aspect of our competition with China into perspective? We don't want to return to what we had in the Cold War, which is just solid, across the board opposition to another country. We want to cooperate in some areas. We want to ensure there is peace in Asia, not just a cold peace, but a prosperous peace. And what are your thoughts on balancing the various aspects of this competition, the military, the diplomatic, the economic, the values part of it?
Thank you very much for that. In terms of military power, the role of it has very much changed during the Cold War, after that, and currently. At the same time, I do think that when you think about defense, the core part of military has not changed. That we need to be aware of politics as well as what the public are working on. Within that, during the Cold War and the current situation, I completely agree that things are different. And currently, we do need to think about economy, technology, politics, everything, as you said. And within that, we need to move. And so we can't rely just on military power to influence each other. We have to think about all the factors that come in. And so, as Admiral Blair said, we cannot compete with each other just with the military, but also think about politics, the economy, diplomacy, and use all of that to compete with China. At the same time, with the South China Sea, this gray zone, hybrid, all sorts of terms are being used. But when something is done first by China, fait accompli, then in that case we really need to deal with it right away. And we need to work on deterrence so that China cannot act first. We need to seriously consider this point.
Observation when I was in command, if we could keep the military aspect of the competition at a behind the scenes, not prominent level, then that was the right way to handle it. And then with a military stability, there could be competition and cooperation in these other areas. I was really struck, General Ariki, in your remarks and also Ambassador Sugiyama's remarks about this emphasis on Japan defending itself as a primary area. When I was a junior officer working with Japan Self-Defense Forces and right up through my time as Pacific Commander, it was very much the United States in the lead and Japan military Japan Self-Defense Forces following. It wasn't blind following, but there was a definite disparity in the forces. I think two events have changed that. Number one we've talked about was 3/11. I mean, that was Japan's problem. The ground self-defense forces reacted very, very strongly, and the United States came in support. In fact, talking to those who were closely involved, Japan self-defense forces really didn't need American assistance. You had far more soldiers, sailors, and airmen involved, but you found a useful role for the support that the United States could bring. So there was that event. Second, there was the Senkaku's contingency beginning about 2012, and for a Chinese military threat to the Senkakus, clearly it was a Japanese lead responsibility, and the United States was supposed to act in support. So I think these two events have really changed the thinking in both Japanese and American defense leadership about the balance of the responsibilities in the two sides of this alliance. Can you give us a little more of your thoughts on this sort of changing of the balance of leadership and initiatives and responsibilities in the U.S.-Japan military alliance?
Thank you very much. In terms of the responsibility of the leader, if I can just explain about how I think the Great East Japan earthquake was, and nobody predicted it. It was such a great, big earthquake. And the fact that we have to deal with such a big earthquake, we still had to consider the fact that we have to defend Japan, but at the same time work with this disaster relief. So we have to consider the balance between those two responsibilities. and we had to think about 100,000 personnel of the STF. And we had to consider why we weren't able to operate fully. It's because we were on the ground dealing with such a great disaster. And I personally thought that the ground SDF had to be in Tokyo, Osaka, and southern Kyushu. We cannot move from there. And the maritime SDF and the air SDF had to work on maritime emergencies as well as scrambles. And so we were only able to move 120,000 or 130,000. And so that's why we had to think about working on disaster relief while keeping in station the people who are working on the defense of Japan. And so within that framework, the U.S. military was kind enough to help us. And the 7th Fleet of the Navy. And because we were thinking about defense of Japan, the 7th Fleet of the Navy worked with us on this. And so in that regard, working on disaster relief, but at the same time cooperating with defending the area. I can say that leaders were able to prioritize what was most important. And in terms of each of these operations, we had to think about the Korean Peninsula, the East China Sea, etc., all at the same time in terms of defense. And within those types of emergencies, the military commander must think, the SDF commander must think about how to balance that using all the capabilities that they have.
It was done very, very well. Well, I have far more questions than we have time, General Ariki, but we have many distinguished panels who will discuss aspects of this. And once more, I would like to thank you for your remarks and for starting this conference off. And if everyone would please join me.
Ladies and gentlemen, first panel will begin momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, our first panel, Indo-Pacific Grand Strategy, Is It More Than Countering China?, will be moderated by Dr. Michael Green. Michael Green is the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Green?
Thanks very much, Chris. And good morning, everyone. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel to what looks from here like a very distinguished audience. So we'll be sure to leave some time at the end of this panel to get some questions and observations from the floor. We're going to talk today about the broad strategic framework that the U.S. and Japan face in the Indo-Pacific. What do we make of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy? Is the challenge, is the future of the region all about China? How do we network with other like-minded states? This panel is kind of the scene setter for the panels that will follow up and go into more detail on defense and economics. And we have an all-star cast. We'll turn first to Dr. Evan Feigenbaum, who's a Vice President of Studies at Carnegie, and an old China and Eurasia hand with experience in the State Department and the RAND Corporation. And then to Nori Nishi, former Vice Minister of Defense, and a thinker on strategy, China defense, and Japan's role in the world. And finally, Yuki Tatsumi from the Stimson Center. Yuki's done work on not only U.S.-Japan defense relations, but on the broader Japanese strategic approach to the region and the alliance with the United States. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to open up with some thoughts, and I'll prompt them with a question. And what I'd like to ask Evan to get us started is, how should we think about the strategic dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region? Is it all about China? What's the broader network of relationships we might think about? And how do we, the U.S. and Japan as allies, deal with a China that's increasingly coercive and difficult, and yet incredibly important economically and in other ways to both our interests?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
かなりのご質問ですね、笹川、ありがとうございます。そして古い
Voice. I just got off a plane from Taiwan and I came back with a terrible cold and cough. So if I wheeze my way through this, I hope you'll forgive me. Is it all, well, I guess first, is it all about China? I hope it's not all about China. China is obviously in the background for everybody because, among other things, they have scared their neighbors silly in many ways over the last decade to decade and a half. Through choices and behaviors, but obviously there's more going on in the region, and there's more to the agenda of countries in the region. And so if the American agenda in the region is simply all about China, we're missing, both in the bilateral contexts and in the regional context, so much about the things that motivate governments, firms, people. I think the way I answer, I divide it into two parts. I'd say something about the problem with making it all about China, and then second, what the challenge with China is, because it's very substantial, particularly for the United States. To fight China everywhere, you're fighting two dynamics. One is you're fighting the map, and the second is you're fighting economic gravity. You're fighting the map because China is really the only country in Asia that is contiguous geographically to every other sub-region of Asia. Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia. And so if you go country by country, region by region, and you say, hey, Kazakhstan, no investment from China. Hey, Singapore, where Sino-Hydro is doing the tunneling for the subway system, no investment from China, you won't get a lot of traction. And I think we see the results of that, from Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to some of the challenges the U.S. has on the Belt and Road with the message it's sending. I was, for a couple of years, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia. So here's a region that is landlocked, and in the case of one country, Uzbekistan, double landlocked by landlocked countries. So there was World Bank research years ago that showed that if you were landlocked, transaction costs alone would knock 1.5 points off your GDP. Off your growth, not off your GDP. So if you're an economy like that and you're looking for growth potential, and the American message is, hey, don't connect yourself to the most dynamic economies in the world, which happen to be to your east and south and include you-know-who. It's not a winning message given the economic challenges. So first you're fighting the map, and then second you're fighting economic gravity because of the sheer size and scope of China's economy. But having said that, I think the United States is pushing on an open door in a lot of countries because of the way that China has managed some of its relationships around the region. Our Japanese friends and colleagues know this better than anybody, but I spend time in India and in a lot of other places, and I think in each of those bilaterals, but also in regional contexts, China hasn't managed those relationships particularly wisely. There's a lot about the Chinese model and Chinese behaviors that has troubled people around the region. I think in the US-China context, there really are two issues that challenge us. One is that for the last couple of decades, for a lot of people, the working theory of the case was that economic integration would mitigate security competition. But if you look at the economic relationship between the United States and China, we are enormously economically integrated. $700 billion in two-way trade. There's 130 plus billion in US FDI stock in China. There's 50, 60 billion in Chinese FDI stock here. You may not know this, there are 113,000 Americans that work for Chinese-owned entities now. So enormously economic integrated. But not only has it not mitigated the security competition, but if anything, the security competition is intensifying. And now the security competition is bleeding back into the economics. So one problem is that we're locked into clashing security concepts, particularly in Asia. A second is that China is in many ways a revisionist power that seeks to alter rules and norms that the United States, Japan, and others would prefer. But China is a highly strategic revisionist. And a lot of people in the United States, I would argue, use revisionist interchangeably with revolutionary. China is a revisionist, but it is not a revolutionary power. Why? Because it accepts most of the forms of the international system, but not necessarily our preferred norms. How do I know China is not a revolutionary power? Because we've had a revolutionary China in the recent past. In the 1960s and 70s, China was opposed to every major global institution. It was on the outside looking in. It was promoting revolution from Bolivia to Borneo. It had segmented, isolated its own economy. It pursued domestic autarky. Clearly, today's China is not that China. And structurally, China is integrated. It's in the P5, it's in the WTO, it's in every protocol and everything from ozone depletion to chemical weapons. So it accepts the forms, but in many cases not our preferred norms. And so I would argue that China's strategy isn't wholesale revisionism in the revolutionary sense. If I could use a markets analogy, it's more analogous to what I would call portfolio diversification, right? So they're investing in certain institutions, but they seek to alter some of the norms. And then in some cases, they hedge by investing in new institutions. So take something like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is often seen as a Chinese counterpoint to the existing Bretton Woods institutions. China's the #3 shareholder in the ADB. It's contributed to World Bank replenishment, to IDA replenishment. So it's more like portfolio diversification. And I'd argue that for the United States and Japan, and here's where I'd stop, that's a much more difficult challenge than if China were a wholesale revolutionary power. As a revolution, it would be much easier to basically assemble the kind of strategy that your question implies, which is to run around to everybody and say, hey, China's a revolutionary power. What kind of order do you want? But the reality is the challenge is more complex because China's been highly strategic, both in the where, the why, and the how of its revisionism. And so I think when you combine trying to fight geography, trying to fight economic gravity with this much more sticky challenge, both in terms of forms and norms, the policy challenge that we face is that much greater, so the bar is that much higher. We can get to this in the discussion, but I would argue the United States has been less successful, and actually Japan has been more successful in dealing with that challenge, and we can talk if you want about why that's the case and why Prime Minister Abe, I think, has been more successful in that.
That's great, thank you. Very compelling, so much so that the clock accidentally added 30 minutes to our time. I'm sorry. Okay, all right. No, I'm not saying this about the quality, not the quantity.
I'm just glad I got through it.
If you're making your points, the organizers suddenly give us extra time because of the important points you raised. And, you know, if China's not revolutionary, it's revisionist. It's probably revisionist in the finest traditions of the United States and Japan, which each, the U.S. in the 19th century, Japan in the 20th, revised the order within our own neighborhood, the U.S. and North America, Japan and East Asia, to establish spheres of influence. That essentially is what rising powers do in their own neighborhood, what Germany did in Europe. But of course, this is the 21st century, and there are rules and there are norms and there are other major powers in the Pacific, not only the U.S. and Japan, India, Australia, Korea, and others. And so revisionism is not such an easy thing for China to do. And yet, you know, there are signs China is trying to establish something like a sphere of influence. But as you point out, you can't go around and tell countries you got to choose, because most don't want to choose, and arguably even the U.S. and Japan are not prepared to choose a world without economic and diplomatic interaction with China. So the bottom line that keeps us together as allies is we have a stake in the open and rules-based Indo-Pacific order. I'm going to turn to Masa, though, because we know what we're after, I guess. How do we get there? What's the strategy that gets us a sustained free and open Indo-Pacific, given all the complications Evan just introduced?
Well, thank you, Mike. What a difficult question to answer. Thank you very much for Sasakawa, US. And honestly speaking, Indo-Pacific is really the difficult concept for me to discuss. The reason is, geographically it's wide, and the Japanese side was comfortable to stay with the concept of the Pacific, or Asia Pacific.
Is your mic on?
I think my phone is on. Okay, it's on. So the point is, why do we have to expand our concept deeply into Indian Ocean? Or what's the meaning to unite the concept of Pacific and India? But how we are going to pay attention to ASEAN 10 and Australia? They are important members, but at the same time, they're on the threshold of these two geographical entities. So the Indo-Pacific is very difficult concept for me to understand. That is the first step to discuss this concept in general. And also, this area was well controlled by the US Navy since 1945, and that covers the oil route from Middle East countries. That was really a lifeline for Japan and for other countries too. Nobody wanted to challenge it because for the stability and the welfare of the economic status. But a recent change is, yes, China. And why China found it necessary to intervene or at least to expand its influence even there. The amazing case is, as you know, we have the anti-piracy operation in Middle East, and that is the international cooperation case, which is very good, and we sent 2 destroyers from Japan. But surprising thing is China sent a submarine for anti-piracy. What for? So apparently we find some different intentions from China to set in to this whole area. But the important difference, let us say, the difference of the Soviet Union and China is, Soviet Union was rather abide by international rules and orders. The confrontation between the United States and Soviet Union was far more serious than the current confrontation between China and the United States. But I think the Soviet Union was not trying to revise rules of the international society. They challenged, but basically based on the understood basis. But China's initiative is more revisionist types of approaches compared with the Soviet Union. So what is the cause of the difference of these two, Soviet Union and China? One more important thing we have to think about the Indo-Pacific is the rise of India. India has its own culture, own background, own history. But still, India's approach to the international society is to fit in the current system. And there exists the sharp difference between China and India, though both of them are emerging power in the 21st century, but there exists sharp difference. So what is our approaches to these two countries? Therefore, one more important thing is the rise of African economy, Africa's status. But unfortunately, it's difficult to discuss the detail because it is still on the way and not not easy to analyze to details yet. So I will not discuss the African status. So what I want to point out is what the concept of the Indo-Pacific should be in the strategic sense, or in the geographical sense, or in economic aspects. So there isn't any one comfortable answer to all these questions. So I pointed out some member countries of the Indo-Pacific. One important thing is ASEAN 10. They're just the middle, how can I say, the joint part of the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, their status. And ASEAN 10 has enjoyed the rather independent status, not rely too much on the United States, not rely too much on China. In other words, the balance of power between China and the United States was rather a comfortable condition for ASEAN 10s. And that was something they wanted. But now, what they find is growing China's status. The balance is important for ASEAN 10. And if the balance is going wrong, they have to adjust it. And therefore, what approaches are going to, what approaches we have to face to ASEAN 10s? When I was in the Ministry of Defense, we discussed what approaches we should have about the capacity building issues for ASEAN 10s with the United States, with Australia, but didn't have sufficient time to analyze the details yet. So it is still the homework for me to do, but what approaches we have to do, what approaches we have to take to ASEAN 10, and that is going to have some huge impact upon our Indo-Pacific concept. Another important point is Australia. Australia is a bit behind the connecting point of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific area, but still Australia is the important ally for us. And I don't think Australia is happy to be forgotten from the old discussions of the Indo-Pacific. So what we have to think now is what kind of rules and orders we have to find in the Indo-Pacific area. That is something that China challenged, the order of the ocean in general. We have developed the concept of the freedom of navigation and or traditional concept of in the ocean, but China has challenged. And China would like to establish its own sphere of influence in South China Sea, or almost to announce that it's their territorial water. This kind of approaches is not really acceptable for the traditional concept of the freedom of navigation. So this is one more case of the revision from China. And one more important thing is the huge economic entity of Indo-Pacific areas, and who is going to enjoy the merit, and what is the way to keep the balance and stability of this whole region. So concluding my comment, Indo-Pacific as a concept, it's very diversified, very difficult to analyze, but still there exists a huge entity that we have to live. And in this area, yes, China is a revisionist, but where the revisionist approach is coming up, I think that is based on their own culture-based background, but that is something I discussed in January, and my discussion is on the paper just published by Sasakawa USA recently. So please have some reference of it. Thank you. And one more important thing is how we are going to unite India into this new system. India is rather independent, rather quiet, want to be isolated, but still becoming an important power. So how we are going to bridge good relations with India. So there are many homeworks to do, but that is my answer to your question. Thank you very
Good,
much.
thank you. I'm sure the audience didn't expect homework, but you now have the homework assignment as well. I want to come back to some of the subregions, ASEAN in particular, and India in the back and forth on the stage, but let me turn to Yuki. you've been watching and working on the mechanics of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Are we, the U.S. and Japan, aligned? And do we have the right defense and foreign policies in place to meet the challenges we've heard from Evan and Nori? Easier question, maybe. It's still hard.
That's a softball question, not really. Thank you, Mike, for that question. And again, let me first start by thanking Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA for giving me this opportunity. If General Oriki was with us in the keynote, I am extra nervous being sit together with this gentleman and facing the audience of your quality. So I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to do my best. In answer to your question, Mike, about before going to the answer to your question, Mike, let me say a little bit, few words, just kind of a scene setting for how it has been for Japan, this concept of Indo-Pacific strategy. Although it didn't have a name of that back then, I would argue Japan's engagement and vantage point of looking at this Indian Ocean area and Pacific Ocean area as one strategic space goes way back from this current time. You're a historian, Mike, so you'll definitely appreciate it, and you'll probably have much older examples, but even with the Prime Minister Abe, when he first was a Prime Minister in 2006 to 2007, we are already seeing the seeds of that concept. When Foreign Minister Aso delivered the speech of Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, and that's around the time where Prime Minister Abe also started to intensify Japan's engagement with both India and Australia, to go back to Nish-san's point about let's not forget Australia. And I think what's remarkable about Japan's security policy direction from that point on is that even during the 3 years of the Democratic Party of Japan administration, that trend essentially was sustained. Japan continued to institutionalize its security relationship both with Australia and India. And then it actually really picked up the pace when Prime Minister Abe came back to the office in December 2011. So I would argue Japan has been on this very steady trajectory. And then also with the engagement with ASEAN, another point that Nish-san brought up. Japan has, as everybody in this room knows, Japan has a long-standing economic engagement with ASEAN 10, going back to Prime Minister Fukuda's time in the Fukuda Doctrine. And that quality and the nature of that engagement with ASEAN began to assume more strategic characteristics, going beyond purely development assistance and economic investment under the auspices of Prime Minister Abe's when the government revised the official development assistance charter and started to prioritize Japanese national strategic interest as a condition of the assistance, one of the condition of assistance and so forth. So I would argue Japan has been at this for a long time. And now back to your questions, Mike, about are we ready as an alliance to face this challenge? I think answer is still open. I think Nish-san's identified a lot of very difficult questions, which alliance, I think, as we move forward, need to find an answer together in a very closely coordinated fashion. But I think between U.S. and Japan, we do have the right tools in place, and this issue will be more thoroughly discussed in our next panel. But I think Japan really stepped up when U.S. stepped back on the multilateral engagement in the trade and economy by leading CPTPP and really taking ownership of this, try to work with the ASEAN 10, Australia, India, and other partners in the region to set the economic order and rules and how that multilateral economic transaction in that big space might look like. So I would say Japan has more of an economic tools forefront. U.S. has more of a military hard kinetic tools up front. But then I think they're both very complementary. And then I think by maintaining a close coordination, moving forward, I think what is key for the alliance is continue that engagement as something sustainable, so that ASEAN 10 or India or Australia don't find themselves in a place that they might have to choose one way or the other. And I think as alliance continues to move forward in a sustainable manner and a close coordination, we will be able to provide that confidence to the rest of the region.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate the history. It's clear that although we're calling it the Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision now, it has roots in the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, the Quad proposal. But as I point out, the author of the FOIP in the foreign ministry is a classmate of mine from SAIS, Suzuki-san. I always point out to him, it's actually Mahan's idea. And Mahan got the idea from Commodore Perry in the 1850s, who, after visiting Japan, argued that in the future, he predicted that the US, Japan, Britain, and possibly Germany from the sea would safeguard the maritime domain against rising continental powers. The only thing was that Perry and Mahan thought the rising continental power would be either China, Russia, or India. So they were mostly right. I want to come back to the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept in a minute, but first I want to focus in on some of the sub-regions. You know, Evan very helpfully pointed out China is contiguous with most of the major sub-regions in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, except of course Australia and the Pacific Islands, but that's pretty significant. And I think everyone on the panel seems to accept that China's engaged in some kind of revisionist power, moving towards some kind of sphere of influence, certainly in a competition for influence. And so I want to ask you, starting with Evan, to assess who's winning in the influence game. And I want to focus in particular on Southeast Asia. And this is a kind of a parlor game, who's quote unquote winning, taking the caveat that we don't want to ask any of these countries to choose sides. In the influence game, since we care about that, who's winning in Southeast Asia? And if you could also address Korea. The Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept has a bit of a blind spot for the Korean Peninsula. Mahan had a bit of a blind spot for the Korean Peninsula. But in the history of East Asia, control over the Korean Peninsula has been critical for determining hegemony and the source of most of the major wars among Japan, China, Russia. So Korea's got to matter. And yet we very rarely talk about the Korean Peninsula or the disposition of the Republic of Korea, where I know there's worry in Tokyo and a little bit in Washington. So I feel a little bit busted a bit so you could think about it, Evan. And if you could start us off, who's winning? Or should we measure it that way? What's the disposition of Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula between the US and China? And we'll go down the line, but begin with...
Well, I think I think my answer with that would start at the structural stuff. I don't think China's winning, but I know we're not. In fact, I think we're in trouble. And I'll just be blunt about it. I think we're in trouble because we're not the United States. When I say we, I mean the United States, but more broadly, that network of partnerships and those who subscribe to certain norms and ideas. And I think the reasons have a lot to do with structural change in Asia that's generational and the way the United States is adapting or not adapting. And I'll give you two examples. One goes back to something that Yuki said. You had an interesting line where you described the US as kind of the security provider and then Japan as the economic rule writer. But if you think about American leadership in Asia in the post-World War II period, and particularly after the 1960s, the United States was a leader in Asia because it was a provider of both security-related public goods and economic-related public goods and other benefits. Security-related public goods through alliances and forward-deployed military presence and carrier battle groups, things that kept the peace. But the United States was not just a security provider. It was the principal provider of economic-related public goods first by being the principal source of demand for which Asia's export-led economies could power their way to prosperity, but then also as a leader on regional and global trade liberalization and investment liberalization. Right, so when I look at the way Asia is evolving today, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific. Right, I'll say that again, there's no basis for collective security. Because among other things, China and Japan have not had a French-German moment, and are not likely to have a French-German moment any time as far as mine eyes can see.
Not the good French-German.
Yeah, so that being the case, the United States was, is, and as far as I can see, will continue to be a crucial security provider, either directly or indirectly for those who free ride on the benefits of the alliance system and other partnerships, for everybody but China, which objects. Okay, but now pivot to the economics. On the economic side, the U.S. will never again be the kind of demand driver that it was in the 1960s and 70s, even though it's going to be a very important source of demand. U.S. trade with every country in Asia going up in absolute terms. It's declining almost everywhere in relative terms, right? Which means that the other pillar of the economic public goods provision, which was to be a leader on regional and global trade liberalization, becomes that much more important. But what's happening? TPP withdrawal, what's happening? If we default to a situation where others become the economic rule writers, I don't necessarily think that's optimal for the United States, even if the rules being adopted are ones that the United States had a role in writing and would approve of. So President Obama used to, when he talked about the TPP, you remember he used to say, if the United States doesn't write the rules, China will write the rules. So intuitively, when the United States withdrew from TPP, who should have moved in to write the rules? China. But that's not what happened. Right? What happened was this collection of 11, with Japan in a pivotal position, became the rule writers, the norm drivers, the standard setters. Is that optimal for the United States? I'd argue it's suboptimal, because structurally, over time, it's not enough for the United States just to be a security provider in the region. So there's that. The second is this integrated Asia idea. I do think that Asia, and this gets at Indo-Pacific, East, Central, and South, Asia is becoming a much more integrated space. You look at China's economic role in Central Asia, which is going to turn into a security role over time. We've talked about India, Japan and India, the whole region is becoming much more integrated. But a region that's more Asian than Asia-Pacific, more continental than subcontinental, more Central Asian than Eurasian, is one in which the United States' centrality can't simply be presumed. In 2/3 of the Eurasian landmass, the United States is diplomatically challenged and commercially irrelevant. I mean, Central Asia, everywhere except Kazakhstan is a foreign direct investor, and that's largely in two extractive sectors. South Asia, other than India, sectoral, some good stories, but broadly speaking, not such a great story for the United States. Mainland Southeast Asia, more of a Japan story, in my view, even Thailand, than an American story. So a more integrated Asia is one in which the United States, to your point about winning and losing, I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but we're certainly not winning because I don't think we're adapting fast enough to some of the structural changes that will make our role different. And if you can't rewind the clock back to 1995, you have to deploy new tools in different ways. So the good news is there's not a single functional problem in the region I can think of where the United States doesn't just have a preponderance of capacity that it could bring. So the United States has an incredibly strong hand to play if it plays it. Best-in-class companies, security role, partnerships, alliances, technologies, innovation power. But I would just ask you, it's sort of a rhetorical question, is the United States playing that hand optimally in each of the subregions that you're interested in? I would argue no. So China may not be winning, because they can't be winning if all of their neighbors are tacking away because they're nervous, but I would argue that we're not winning, and nature bores a vacuum, and as I said at the beginning, China's got the map, and it's got economic gravity in its favor, and so we need to adapt much better than we are. And we need partners that adapt better, and sorry I didn't do Korea, I'll just use India as the example. If you want India to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, India's got to make the choices at home that allow it to do that. Why is India less relevant in Southeast Asia than China is? Because the backbone of Southeast Asian economics, I'm looking at Dave Shear, is integrated supply and production chains. Why is China 13-14% of ASEAN trade and India's hovered around 2.93? Because they haven't really made anything. So this government has Make in India as a policy. The last government, UPA 2, had a national manufacturing policy that was supposed to take manufacturing from 16 to 25% of GDP. But guess what, folks? The share of manufacturing in GDP actually shrank because manufacturing, not just about a manufacturing policy. You need to get labor policies right, land acquisition policies right, and those are very challenging in the Indian context for reasons that have to do with politics, with federalism, with law, with other issues. But I think the tools are there, and the hand is there to play, and the partnerships are there, latently and actively. And I'll just conclude by saying it's a good thing that Japan has been as active as it is. Because if you look at how I set that up, I would argue that Japan's played a much better hand on each of those than the United States has. So it's more of a plea than a critique. But, so I guess I'd say we're losing.
So I think
Does that make sense?
It does. We're losing by not trying. In a way.
We're trying, but it's the wrong tool.
The wrong tools,
Yeah.
or not using the tools we should have. And just picking up quickly on India, I think it's useful to remember that the Reagan administration had the first real strategic document on India in 1982, which argued that India's strength in and of itself is in U.S. interest, regardless of whether or not India aligns with us. And although that's a long time ago, I think that is basically still right. If I had a choice between India being more active in Southeast Asia or India being able to sanitize the Indian Ocean, remain a dominant security player in South Asia, I'd pick the second one in terms of preserving an equilibrium in Asia that limits China's ability to use coercion for revisionist purposes. Of course, we should be working for both, and India is doing more, particularly with Japan.
Absolutely.
So the trends are right, but you point to all the domestic things that will limit it. Nori, pick up the discussion, if you could talk again a little more about Southeast Asia, but also Korea. We're not going to get out of this without talking about Korea.
Sorry.
No, you covered like
Korea is a difficult question for me. Once I discussed that status here in the United States, I'll just repeat my analysis. Last 300 years, the power of the Northeast Asia shifted first from China, then Russia, Japan, and then the United States. It's a cadre of powers, initiative of who is going to take initiatives of the control of Northeast Asia. So in the past 300 years, you find that Korea was just a theater, not a player of the game in this region. And this is really the first time in the last 300 years that Korea came in to this power struggle with nuclear and missiles. So it's very new situation, and it's really the first time for us to see Korea as a player of the game of the region. So the totally different situation in Northeast Asia. Therefore, I think we better divide two games, one in the continental game and one in the oceans game. But yes, there exists connections of these two major games, and that is Northeast Asia. So under the current situation, Northeast Asia is very, very difficult and delicate area to play a game. And that is the only place all over the world that three major nuclear powers face each other. So it's so complicated. But that is where Japan stays. And we have no chance to move away from that area. So we have to work out the scenario to survive. And that the answer is the alliance with the United States. Second, non-nuke state, stay as a conventional powers. The reason is it is important for Japan to keep its vulnerability open to others. In other words, that is a way to invite others, besides China, other ASEAN countries, that Japan is going to stay as a medium power, not trying to challenge hegemonies of the region. Therefore, we can shake hands with you. And that is an important stepstone for ASEAN powers or other Asian powers to unite with the United States. Therefore, Japan is going to stay with that game, and that is the important position for Japan to commit to the power game in the continent and the power game in the ocean. So I think that is the simple and straightforward answer for Japan, how to manage Korean issue and how to manage China's spreading into the ocean. Thank you.
You get to clean up.
That's a hard one. So I think on are we winning or are we losing is a little bit of a black and white question, it seems to me, that I think what my answer would be is that, yes, some of those sub-regions may have been at the very initial stage very swayed by just the amount of cash flow that came in from China. But then when that euphoric period is over, they kind of realize that many of the countries are strapped with heavy debt. And then the diplomatic pressure from Beijing on all kinds of issues to align with them. And they started to, I think, reappreciate the approach that the US has taken and also Japan has certainly taken over the years, especially about their economic well-being of that region is sustainable on their own. And I can recall, Japanese aid is often described as quality but not quantity. So it's all about sustainability, it's all about creation of a local capacity, so that when the aid period is over, local communities can sustain themselves and use that as the springboard to maintain the economic growth. So I think we're coming to the point where many of those countries that was initially attracted to this massive amount of cash that was offered kind of, I guess, woke up and smelled the coffee, maybe the best description that comes to my mind. That actually looks back at what Japan and United States has been doing in the region and say, you know what, I think we actually like that approach better. But then it goes back to the question of how Evan laid out of, we do have right tools, but are we playing them as well as it could? And then I think there are a couple of homeworks to do here and there, and I think the list of homework is different between US and Japan slightly.
So it's kind of a trick question. And I think you nailed it. Success is not going to be defined by the US winning or China winning, as you all pointed out in different ways. Success for us is going to be defined by the states in Southeast Asia, for example, winning. And so when the US or Japan have been on the right side of national aspirations, of nationalism, we win. If we help countries with capacity, if we help them with sustainable investments and infrastructure, when we tell them choose, we lose, historically, whether it's the 50s or the Vietnam War. And the reason China's not winning, I think, can be put in that construct as well. China is kind of telling them to choose. And is pushing countries in ways that run against nationalism and national aspirations, which is why trade is so critical and capacity building is so critical. And the Japanese version of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision has started talking more about inclusivity and this kind of thing. In the US government, the head of USAID, Mark Green, has been quite good about saying free and open Indo-Pacific is about helping these countries choose the right path and succeeding without coercion. So there are ways to articulate this and think about it that will give us real advantage. But we don't win when we say don't build ports, don't take investment.
Murky somethingness beats transparent nothingness.
Yes.
So that's part of the challenge.
So on Korea, there's no easy answer. Obviously, this is one of those really tough diplomatic and more than diplomatic political challenges. I do think, though, and I always ask this question because the problem we have is I don't think the US version or the Japanese version of FOIP pays adequate attention to the Korean Peninsula and in particular the ROK. And in Seoul, there's a myopia right now. People in the current government in Seoul don't like to think about Asian regional issues. They're very, very focused on North Korea. So even if we don't find a solution, tabling it and thinking strategically is good, and China's not winning in South Korea. Opinion polls show that's not the case. The shift in investment towards Southeast Asia shows that Korea's hedging the way Japan began 2 years ago. But it is the cockpit of Asia, and we need, with our friends in Seoul, to think about it strategically. One area, so we've talked about this world we live in where we're seeing Asian economic integration, trade with China, investment, but intense competition at the same time. It's very hard to imagine decoupling of the US or Japanese or other economies from China, especially if you're a farmer in Ohio or a manufacturer in Japan. But there is one area where decoupling seems to be happening, and it's in technology and in the area of 5G, Huawei, telecommunications. It's an issue within the US and Japanese economies and other so-called Five Eyes, allies and partners. But it's also one of the areas of competition in South and Southeast Asia. And I wonder if we could, before we go to the question, just touch on that, because that is one area where you may see a reversal of the integration trend and possibly the emergence of two blocks, or maybe it's more muddy. Evan, you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Well, I think the issue of technical standards and who sets them is a big one. It's not just rules in the trade sense, but technical. I mean, we mentioned the Belt and Road before. The most interesting thing to me about the Belt and Road is the standard setting, right? If China builds it, they build it to a Chinese standard, which means essentially you can export your indigenous engineering standard and make it a default regional and global standard. And in a lot of areas of technology or systems integration, the Chinese standard is different. So if you want to plug and play, then you need to figure out how to accommodate the Chinese standard. So one example, I was at in a previous incarnation, at an institute that I was the director of, we published a paper on a technology, ultra-high voltage power lines. This is a next generation power system technology, keeps power very stable, you can deliver bulk loads over long distances. The US is building not very much of this. China's building thousands and thousands and thousands of miles. So because China has the market power as the principal consumer of it, when you then couple your market power to being an exporter, you can become the standard setter by default. And in a lot of these standard setting bodies, that's what we see happening. So then if you move to the question of decoupling, how do you decouple when you have large areas of the globe where on this technology, this system, either China has set the standard or China has set a standard, or you can't plug and play in that region without figuring out how to be interoperable with the Chinese standard. So, the former Soviet space, for instance, it's a giant pilot project for a lot of Chinese systems. Technical systems, payment systems, and so if you want to do business there, you have to figure out what to do in terms of the standard setting. So I think that will be an issue, because what you could end up with is, I don't know, decoupling, but you could end up with bifurcated, trifurcated, and then whatever comes after trifurcated standards, and you could have a lot of division among regions. I think the higher end areas, the more cutting, emerging and foundational technology, 5G, quantum computing, these very transformational things, or things like AI that are intrinsically dual use. Those are the areas where the US government and other governments obviously are taking the most interest, because they have national security but also competitiveness implications and standard setting implications. The 5G one is going to be interesting to watch, because I think how that plays out is going to depend a lot on the region. And you mentioned the Five Eyes, and we had this story this morning on the UK, which is the government in the UK approved Huawei in the 5G, but not in the core part of it. But there will be Huawei in the system. There are large chunks of the globe where I think a decoupling message won't work. It's hard for me to imagine in Southeast Asia, for instance, any country in Southeast Asia stripping Huawei equipment out of the backbone. So then that gets back to the standard setting issue. How do we manage a world where we have non-interoperable regions? But I think that's where we're going. And it's not just the US that's talking about decoupling. I mean, frankly, China, I wrote a book on techno-nationalism in China. China's had a kind of indigenization view of technology for a long time. And I think the way the trends are emerging, including domestically in China, that's where China is going as well. Ultimately the question is, a lot of the questions are about China. What kind of economy does China want to be? And how integrated does China want to be? If you want to be a world-class financial services center, you need world-class standards and best-in-class financial services firms. Same on the technical side. But I think where we're going is to the very non-harmonized world that you described. That's a function of policy, but also technology.
Dorothy, if you want to add on this?
Yeah, I would, but I would defer to Nissan if he wants to go first.
Well, just a quick comment about the recent Huawei's case. That actually invites a huge attention from the Japanese society. It's really the trigger for us to revise that what kind of security system we have. Because we do not have any security clearance system of individuals. There is no security clearance mechanism to check backdoors type of things. In other words, industrial chains, security issues. So all these questions of how we are going to secure our society, our industry, our production, these questions are well raised by, in conjunction with Huawei's issue together. So this is going to be something new in Japan, and we have to discuss these issues detailed way.
Yeah, let me add real quickly because Nissan touched on it. So one of the many changes that Prime Minister Abe made into Japan's defense institutions are revision of the arms export policy. But with this, what you described as almost like a decoupling, and especially under this administration, all these policies have been rolled out about supply chain management on the defense technology realm, and how to ensure that those technologies are not go through back door onto the other side. That could actually have that could present a huge complication for many of the Japanese defense industries, because Japanese defense industry are fundamentally different from US defense industry in the sense that there are only a share or small portion of larger corporation, bulk of which has a lot of business with China. So can that small department can create this technology safe space when the rest of the corporation wants to do business with China, and then especially how US applies this supply chain management standard to partner with on the defense industrial partnership. It could have a huge impact on defense industry, and I think Japan is just trying to started to wrap its arms around with the gravity of that question.
It's too late to say there will be no Huawei in the U.S. or Japan or Britain. I mean, there's Huawei being used in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and SoftBank has to deal with Huawei. I think the British may have hit on the Toshirokuro, the place where the Five Eyes in the industrial countries end up, which is that the core switching components and other elements do not allow Tencent or ZTE or Huawei in. For the most advanced technology countries in the world, countries like India will be kind of fighting this out, and then some countries, sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost too late perhaps. The interesting question is whether this changes Chinese behavior. Does that market access problem lead to different policies in China? It's hard to see that because Huawei and ZTE already have a complete backdoor to the Ministry of State Security. It's hard to undo that. But it's also an interesting question whether that changes the dynamics in U.S.-China relations. When we have economic blocks forming and decoupling, that's dangerous. That's what happened in the 1930s. Does it matter if it's just in one very important area of technology? It's going to be, in my view, one of the most important things U.S. and Japan work on. It's kind of a waste that we're spending a lot of political capital talking about, auto tariffs or voluntary auto export restraints when this is what the President of the United States and the Prime Minister should be really focused on. Because there's no easy, clean answer to this, but there are some pretty fundamental national security and technology issues at stake. You're looking like you want to weigh in. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. I think we have microphones. Identify yourself, keep it brief, please. Right over here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. 1 million human beings locked into unpaid labor camps, creating the next generation of Muslim terrorists. That's all I need to hear to conclude that the Communist Party has lost the legitimacy to rule over a quarter of mankind. What more does the Japan-US alliance need to hear to draw that same conclusion?
So, Xinjiang, specifically, but just more broadly, the repression that everyone sees in Xi Jinping's China, what does it mean for us? Why don't we start with you this time, if that's okay?
Since it's a really hard question.
And Japan is Japan's not as outspoken on Xinjiang as the U.S. or Britain or some other countries.
So I think this goes back to the geography where Japan sits. That in a sense, Japan's geography, in some way, presents a hard choice for Japan, any Japanese leader, on even if Japan doesn't like what China is doing, how strongly Japan would come out and articulate that. And I think issues like human rights, in the case of Xinjiang or minorities, I think it's I think one of those issues, because there's no question that Japan is fundamentally committed to these universal values like fundamental human rights, gender equality, freedom from coercion, repression, all that. However, by coming out too strongly on that side of the equation could sometimes rid Japan off of the opportunity to stay engaged in China. Or I think I would say swap name of the country with like any other country. And that's exactly what Japan did in Myanmar, that it made a conscious choice of engaging with the junta. Well, even though it didn't really, I don't think Japan liked the nature of the government. But it made a choice of continuous engagement, and if that's what it takes, that's sometimes I think the pragmatic way that Japan does. And should Japan be more forceful in voicing that concern? It could probably, maybe. But then I think Japan's geography with China, and then it's just so close to Chinese landmass, sometimes doesn't give Japan that luxury.
So setting aside what Japan says about Xinjiang or human rights in China, I take your point. Setting that aside for a minute, do you think, for the Americans in the audience, do you think that the repression we're seeing, not only in Xinjiang, but in academia in China and civil society, is that affecting the Japanese calculus? Because it sure is in Washington and London and Canberra. I mean, one of the reasons you see China scholars in the US putting out reports that are pretty hawkish, I think, is because of what they're seeing with their friends who are scholars, what they're seeing in Xinjiang. Is it having that same effect on the Japanese assessment of the China problem?
I think it does. And honestly, I momentarily lost my train of thought, but I definitely does. And then I think that also raises a question. We've been talking about technology, how technology like AI and deep machine learning can be used for, if the government decides to do so, to put those advanced technology in that nefarious purposes.
To the surveillance state we're seeing.
The surveillance state.
Yeah.
So I think that also presents a really important question of how U.S. and Japan is going to I guess, mitigate that risk. And then I think not everyone is really talking about it, but I think what Prime Minister Abe proposed at the Davos earlier this year is highly important, which is he basically said, let's start the conversation about how kind of a code of conduct of this like data management. And let's start that with the G20.
That is a kind of...
And then I think it's really important that he made that proposal out there, at least to start talking about it, because this issue is so huge that it will take a long time for the consensus to be formed. But at least that conversation has to happen in an inclusive way. So it was important that he offered G20, not G7, because we don't want the rest of the world to say, hey, it's another G7, rulemaking.
And that is, in a way, Kachikan Gaiko, a values diplomacy
and then,
issue.
in a sense that it also includes China, right? I mean, China needs to come into the G20 fold. So I think that was a very strategically smart choice that he made when he announced that in Davos.
Nori or Evan, you want to weigh in on this?
Yep, just one more thing. The revival of the past glory is really the dream that Xi Jinping raised. But that means China suffered badly since mid-19th century. And that obsession is still quite strong in China. In other words, China felt that they're still circled by major powers. So, for example, the interesting case is President Obama's days. The United States proposed a further reduction of nuclear issues to Russia, and Russia rejected it. But that invites China's skepticism, what this initiative is. And then here comes the ban of the INF. And finally, China got understanding that, oh, this is a long story. Russia and the United States is trying to shake hands against China's military expenditures, against China's nuclear capabilities. So it is Chinese philosophical reaction, or the psychological reaction, that China is threatened by others. Therefore, the regime, how to keep the regime in good shape is really a serious demand for the Chinese government. The expenditure for the internal security is much more than the military expenditure, and that is very threatening for the Chinese financial conditions. But still, that is a necessary expense for China. And these things are well shared by the Japanese society. We are rather quiet for these issues because that's China's internal issue, but still very delicate and frustrating issue for the Japanese society.
Well, I think the trajectory China's on is not a good one right now. And I was at a dinner last night and I said, for a couple of decades, economics was sort of the secret sauce in China. Every problem had an economic solution, right? People are out protesting, growth, employment. The neighbors are scared of you, trade, investment. So always had an economic solution. For this current administration in China, politics is the key to everything. And particularly in Xi Jinping's first term, his first, second, and third agenda was basically the Communist Party, the Communist Party, and the Communist Party. Party discipline, ideological conformity, anti-corruption, and the goal was to strengthen the system of Leninist governments that exists in China. There are a lot of reasons for that, but I think if you rewind to some of the problems that they've had, the social, political, and economic contracts in China are all kind of unraveling at the same time. The social contract being that people would stay out of organized politics, the Communist Party would dominate everything, and in exchange, people would get material gain, material benefit, material opportunity. But as I frequently say, when you've had hundreds of millions of people who've had their material welfare enhanced, their expectations and demands transcend material things. And the things that people tend to go out in the streets and protest over in China now that threaten the legitimacy of the party and political stability as the party sees it are things like tainted blood, bad air, unsafe food, unsafe water, non-material things. Xi Jinping is supposed to be the most powerful leader in China since Mao Zedong. The most powerful leader in China since Mao Zedong spends a lot of time talking about things like toilets, a toilet revolution. Why? Because the things that I think are threats to their legitimacy are increasingly these non-material, and that's a social contract that's unraveling. The political contract too, you have unrepresentative, undemocratic government, one-party state, Leninist principles, run by a communist party, but that was widely seen by a lot of its citizens as responsive in a public policy sense, delivering material benefit, economic growth, employment gains. But in a whole series of crises, the state has underperformed, and the social welfare system in China has lots of problems. So the government is still unrepresentative and then doesn't look so responsive anymore either. So there's that. But what's interesting is this administration's solution to that is to strengthen the political tools that they tend to default to. So they're trying to build a system of adaptive governance, cleaner governance, but with this very Leninist superstructure. And whether they're successful at that will say a lot about what trajectory China's on for the next 10 years. But I think from our perspective, certainly from my perspective, the scope and scale of repression and tightening in the system has increased significantly in the last few years, and in almost every dimension of life.
I was struck that your old boss, Hank Paulson, gave a speech in Singapore late last year, or early this year, where he used the word iron curtain to describe what China is doing to itself. Pretty striking. And when Hank Paulson, who's made 90 trips to China, starts to express that kind of concern, there's a consensus across the spectrum in the U.S. that this is a problem, and I think there's a consensus in a lot of other countries. We have room for one more question. Yeah, right in the front here.
Also, Furumoto, Japan's Mainichi newspaper. Let me go back to the FOIP concept. Prime Minister Abe has been trying to mend the relationship with China in the past 2 years or so. I'm wondering if this Prime Minister Abe's soft approach to China now is good or bad for to promote the concept of FOIP. You can argue it is bad because this is all about China. It is a time to give pressure to China. But you can also argue it is good because this is not containment to promote, to bring China into the international norms. This soft approach can work. Look at Japan. Japan is also almost embracing one belt road. So you can argue both arguments. But so, could you give us some thoughts?
I think it's good that Japan is, again, engaging China because there are two reasons for engagement, right? You want to engage because it wants to have a positive relation, and for Japan, I go back to my point that I made earlier, is that its geography requires Japan to have at minimum functional relationship with Beijing at all times. There are a lot of issues that Tokyo and Beijing disagree, but Tokyo needs a functional relationship with its biggest neighbor. So that's one. But then the other thing that I would say is by engaging China, especially on some of the economic initiatives, Japan also can actually have a role to shape the way that China engages in those economic endeavors. So bringing China into the, not exactly into the fold, but then at least it can shape how China approaches it by basically partnering in some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects and infrastructure, by Japan also becoming a stakeholder in it. And then that's far more convincing and influencing Chinese decisions rather than staying outside and saying, no, this is, you shouldn't go that way, this is because it's not the right way to do so. So I think Japan's calculation is a good one, I think.
Others? I think it's good on balance. I think it's very predictable, frankly. It's the 40th anniversary of the 1978 treaty between Japan and China that set up yen loans and deepened diplomatic relations. And every 10-year anniversary, both governments try to fix things as they're going downhill. It happened in '98. Usually it's the second term of the Chinese leader. And so they don't do Japan in the first term. So '98 it didn't go well because Jiang Zemin, lectured the Japanese emperor on the history issue. 2008, didn't really change things, but put a floor under the relationship. So in a lot of ways, this is a somewhat cyclical part of post-Cold War Japan-China relations and helps to stabilize things. So it doesn't hurt. And as Yuki pointed out, I think there's some evidence that Japan's engagement is shaping, at least superficially, if not more, Chinese approaches. Look at the Belt and Road Conference this year. The second Chinese triumphant international conference on Belt and Road. The title of it is Quality Infrastructure. Where did that come from? Japan. So I think there is, at least in the rhetoric that China is using, some influence. And so it's not bad for the US, and it might even be useful because while the Trump administration and the Congress have taken a much, much tougher line on China, and in most cases warranted in 5G and Huawei and on foreign influence and other things, I was quite struck by the speech that Vice President Pence gave at Hudson, which gave a pretty accurate list of things China's doing to us that are bad. But then it had this sort of passing line saying, of course, we hope to cooperate with China there was no agenda for cooperation. So I think Japan has real bona fides, real credibility in Washington for its hawkishness on China, and can now cash those in a little bit to help, if not moderate, at least shape the US administration and congressional view. Because as Evan pointed out at the beginning, winning is not gonna, we're not gonna win if our definition is don't do things with China. I mean, we need an agenda for cooperation too, and I think Japan, more than probably any other country, has the credibility to present that agenda. And the reason you know is, over this 40th anniversary of Japan-China Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, what happened? Chinese tactical air incursions in the Senkakus went up 5-fold. Military exercises doubled. It's not like China's in love with Japan all of a sudden. It's not like the US has to worry about Japan and China going off without us. The structure and the tensions are still very much there. So it's a good question to end on. This has been a really interesting panel. It reminds me of the play dates that Evan's kids and my kids used to have about 6-7 years ago in his basement, where they take out all the toys and throw them all over the floor. It was lots of fun, and then they didn't clean up. So we did. Yeah, you did. So the panels after us will have to play the role of Evan and Kim Feigenbaum cleaning up all the toys we just threw on the floor. But it was certainly fun for us. So thanks for joining us. Let's congratulate our panel. Thank you.
Xander and Xander. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will take a 15-minute break. Our next panel, Economic Influence and Competition in the Indo-Pacific Region, moderated by Matthew Goodwin, will begin at 11 a.m.
I thought now you were back.
I enjoyed the throwing of toys.
Yeah, it was good. I like that metaphor. You should have seen it. Still does.
Well, you had some cool toys also, so thanks very much.
Oh, yeah.
Can we get these two?
Yeah, please.
How are you? Good. Ask your question. Yeah, that's a fun thing.
Yeah.
That's the point. Indefinite
And you
Chicago.
need-
All right.
Oh, okay.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, my pleasure. I do.
You
sure.
can-
Okay, do. Was that coherent? Or? I hope it was coherent.
Yeah, so I told Dr. Green, but he said he wanted to ask a question. Yeah. Is she finished? It's probably hot. Thank you. No problem.
I'll find something. Probably make a little more room here. Make sure they have room to get around. 1 hour late. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start momentarily. Please have a seat. Okay. Are they not allowed to? Ready? Great. Our next panel, Economic Influence and Competition in the Indo-Pacific Region, will be moderated by Matthew Goodwin. Matthew is Senior Vice President and Senior Advisor for Asian Economics and Simon Chair in Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Matthew?
Okay, thanks. Are we on here? Can you hear me? There we go. Thanks so much. And thank you to Sasakawa USA for inviting me to, actually double thank you. First of all, for inviting me to participate in this, this great conference, and terrific to see so many friends out here. And secondly, for putting the economics session before lunch. Usually it's the end of the day, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and at a security conference. But seriously, I assume there's method in that madness, in the sense that, you know, economic issues are really increasingly of interest and I think importance in the security discussions in our alliance, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific region. So we think they're important, and we want to try to get into some of them. I understand I was a little late to the last panel, but I understand you covered a lot of this ground already, but we're going to cover it again in our own way with real experts here. I don't know, that last group, I'm not sure they really knew what they were talking about. But so let me just, always safe with the moderator to just say a word or two about the title. So we're supposed to talk about influence and competition. So influence, you know, is a function of a bunch of things, right? Persuasion, coercion, attractiveness, and economic incentives, and maybe some other things. And I think I'd like to understand from the panel, and then ultimately from you and your questions, how we think those factors play among the 3 big countries that I think we're going to be talking about in practice here, which are the United States, Japan, and China. And how they use those tools and how those may be changing the way they're using those tools. Because I think I sort of did my own little matrix of who uses which of those things, and I think those things have changed a little bit over time. And so I'm interested in exploring, you know, what influence means and how each of those countries uses them. And then on competition, I always say to a security crowd that for economists, competition is not a bad thing. Competition is why we get up in the morning and sort of go out and try and, you know, do a good job at work and earn money and, you know, in a positive sense, try to better ourselves or better society or whatever. So I think for the folks up here, competition is not a zero-sum thing at all. It's something that potentially is very positive. And so if you're expecting us to say, you know, give you zero-sum answers like the US and Japan have to do this, so China can't do that, it may be a little more nuanced than that, because I think we think there's sort of a more, I shouldn't speak for them, but I think that for economics folks, there is a bit of a different perspective on competition. So I'm interested in exploring that through these various forums and acronyms that we're about to spew out here. So we have a lot of brain power up here. All of these are old friends, but let me make sure I get all their titles right. So right next to me, Maria Solis is Director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies, and Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. Delighted to have Maria with us again. We do a lot of things together. I'm delighted to have her here. Next to her is Ambassador David Scheer, again, I think well known to this audience, who is ambassador to Vietnam, and he's senior advisor at McClarty Associates. He's also affiliated with he's the chairman of the National Association of Japan-America Societies. So delighted to have Dave here as well. We worked together in the embassy in Tokyo way back when. Next to him is Tobias Harris, again known, I think, to Sasakawa crowd, fellow for economy, trade, and business. Here with Sasakawa and has other hats as well, but delighted to have Tobias up here with us. And I'll make a plug for his book as well, prematurely. He's writing a biography on Prime Minister Abe in English, so possibly the first one. So stay tuned for that about a year from now, right? Yep. It'll be out. Okay, and then Tsuneo Watanabe, better known to this audience as Nabe. But we should probably say Nabe-san, shouldn't we? Somehow, you know, it seems wrong. Nabe. Okay, Nabe is good enough. All right, Senior Research Fellow with Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and again, an old friend and a former CSIS fellow as well. So we're delighted to have a family member up here as well. Okay, so I'm going to try and divide this conversation into 3 pieces, if we can, to have a little bit of discipline. So the first is I'm just going to ask an open-ended question about how each of you sees this question of economic influence and competition in the Indo-Pacific. So it's sort of a sense I'm giving each person a chance to just give a broad overview. Then we'll do a discussion of trade and then of infrastructure These distinctions are a little artificial, but I think it's useful in terms of focusing the conversation a little bit. So first, Maria, what does influence and competition look like in the Indo-Pacific from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you to the Sasakawa Foundation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good morning to everybody. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with my fellow panelists. Let me just start by alluding to some key trends that I see in the region. First off, I would start by saying that the landscape in the Indo-Pacific is shifting very rapidly. Even for people like us who are watching these developments constantly, it's hard to keep up. So we've gone in the past 2 or 3 years from the near death of the TPP when the United States withdrew to its actual rescue through Japan's leadership. We've also gone through, tit-for-tat trade war between the United States and China to now an attempt to bring possibly a historic deal. We don't know if this will come through, but the idea is that we're in the last weeks and there might be an agreement nearby. We've also been very much concerned with trying to understand what are China's intentions with the Belt and Road Initiative, how it will be implemented, and with what consequences. We've seen Japan step up its game with a partnership for quality infrastructure, and the United States finally trying to get in the game with the passing of the BUILD Act and other steps. And we also see some very recent incipient attempts at collaboration on infrastructure finance among different groups of countries. But the point I would make is that the field is hot, that there are many moving pieces, that different players are taking different positions. But there's one important trend I want to highlight. And that is that the United States, I would say, unfortunately, is coming from behind. It's not leading in this effort. I think it has been hard for the current US administration to craft an economic strategy vis-a-vis Asia that has a positive message, that is credible, and that is nimble. And the most important point that I would drive with these opening remarks is that I think that the United States is coming from behind, largely because of its own choices. And what I mean by this is a number of own goals, mistakes that have major consequences. I think that there have been 2 major mistakes, and I worry that we may be about to make a third one, and I hope that we don't go there. So let me then highlight what I think are those issues that are hindering U.S. leadership in this fast-moving race in the Indo-Pacific on trade and investment. As I alluded before, the first own goal, I think, is the U.S. withdrawal from a Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. I think that this was a huge credibility blow for the United States. I think it does diminish influence in the region, and I also think it has important economic costs to American producers. And we're all familiar with the latest figures as to how, CPP producers, those that remain in the TPP, are now increasing their market share in Japan in sectors like beef, pork, and wheat, and how American farmers are taking a hit because of that decision. So that's, I think, the first major own goal. The second, I think, mistake that we've seen recently is the use of what I would characterize as bogus national security tariffs targeting allies. This is a so-called 232 report whereby the United States has said that imports of steel, for example, are hindering national security and therefore an increase in tariffs. And the target of those tariffs, I think, ironically and tragically, have been on our closest partners and allies. And this is a problem because I think it undermines the possibility of creating a coalition of like-minded countries who would like to then come up with new rules to tackle market-distorting policies from countries that embark on, say, state capitalism models. So if we think that the metal tariffs have created division, have sown discord, weakened a potential coalition, then imagine what would happen if indeed there was a tariff on automobiles. And we know that the Commerce Department has finished the report. President Trump has until next month to make a decision on what to do with that report. So that, I think, would be extremely costly for US leadership, and certainly with the attempt to try to deal with China. And the third potential own goal that I hope that we do not commit has to do with a potential mishandling of bilateral trade negotiations with Japan. What are the potential pitfalls here? How could we make this a mistake and not an opportunity? Is if we frame these trade negotiations as one-sided concessions from Japan, if we try to revert back to managed trade tactics, demanding of Japan export restraints on automobiles, and if the president at some point were to make good on that threat and impose the auto tariff. My concern is that if we were to do that, then we would breach trust and we would undermine the possibilities of close coordination with a very close ally. And this is important because just as I was highlighting how the United States has committed some own goals, in the same period of time, what I see Japan is giving us more and more surprises on what it can actually do on economic statecraft. I think that we all have had to correct our understanding of how proactive Japan could be in this space. So it was, not just the entering into the TPP, but the ability to negotiate an ambitious trade agreement, an ability to support the United States in the rules area of the negotiations, and then the big surprise of then rescuing the TPP once the United States was not there. More surprises, a trade agreement with the European Union and all these other initiatives on quality infrastructure finance and a digital economy, so much more proactive Japan. I end up with this. The United States and Japan have a much better chance to compete in the trade and investment race in Asia Pacific if they work together. And there are many areas where they can do this effectively, disseminating digital economy standards, offering diversification options for developing countries in Asia when it comes to financing projects. This can be done through pooling resources, but also through promoting higher connectivity standards, and then codifying rules on market distorting policies. Now, the common denominator to all these initiatives, and this is indeed my last point, is that they're effective because they transcend the bilateral framing. This is about what the United States and Japan can do in the region and globally. And I think it would be a third goal if we miss up on this an opportunity for coordinated economic statecraft.
Terrific. Lots there and lots to follow up on. So thank you, Maria. Dave, same question, sort of what do influence and competition look like from your perspective in the Indo-Pacific? In particular, having been ambassador to Vietnam, how do you think countries like Vietnam see those issues, see the three countries' influence and the competition among them in the region?
Thanks, Matt, and glad to be here today. I'd like to share with you a few of my experiences in the economic sphere as ambassador to Vietnam. And when I went to Vietnam, the strategic importance of the economic relationship was every bit as crucial for me as the strategic importance of U.S.-Vietnam defense ties. And I worked both pieces of that portfolio very hard when I was ambassador. On the economic side, I was basically engaged in trade promotion, of course, getting the Vietnamese engaged in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And early in my tenure as ambassador, I made a very strong try to get more Exim Bank involvement in Vietnam, which was ill-fated, actually. And I worked very hard as an ambassador establishing strong relations with my Japanese counterparts and sharing our thoughts on what we could do together in Vietnam. On trade promotion, of course, we do well in Vietnam. U.S. exports to Vietnam have increased by double digits over the past few years. I sold a lot of Boeings. I helped sell a lot of Boeings. I helped sell a lot of GE engines, a lot of services related to Vietnam's growing service sector as well. On Trans-Pacific Partnership, my goal going out as ambassador was to get the Vietnamese to agree to participate in the negotiation. And I worked very closely with Mike Froman and Wendy Cutler on that issue. Human rights was a part of that. We recognized that the Vietnamese would have a problem with human rights when TPP went to Congress for approval. So we linked Vietnam's participation in TPP with human rights practices in Vietnam. We had some successes there. We also devised a very strong strategic argument for Vietnam's participation in TPP. Vietnam's participation in that trade agreement was not just in its economic interests, it was in its strategic interests. It would help Vietnam diversify its trading partners, help Vietnam do more than just accommodate itself to Chinese economic interests. The Vietnamese grabbed that principle immediately. They understood it immediately. They understood it in many ways faster and more thoroughly than some American advocates of TPP did. But it caught on. And they joined TPP negotiations in 2013. I worked with them, allies in the Vietnamese government, in a parallel fashion to devise a list of doable things in human rights. We distilled it into a to-do list. I put it on a plastic card that my officers carried in their shirt pockets to mention to the Vietnamese at every opportunity, and we had progress. And that kind of leverage is gone now that TPP is gone. The strategic argument for stronger Vietnam economic relations with the U.S. is still there, but it's been diluted in the absence of a Trans-Pacific partnership. I also made a push for stronger Exim Bank support, particularly for U.S. infrastructure participation in the Vietnamese economy as well. I got my commercial counselor to work Washington on this subject. We sent in a cable on the need for increased Exim Bank participation in Vietnam, listing all the reasons why it would be good for them to do it and how they could do it. Pissed Exim Bank off a lot. And even after that, I kept trying. I had a visiting senator in my car on the way to the foreign ministry for his meetings with the foreign minister. I decided to give him my Exim Bank pitch, which I did in about 30 seconds. And he turned to me and said, Exim Bank is just corporate welfare for Boeing. So there are a lot of Washington sort of attitudes we need to change if Exim Bank and OPIC are going to perform the roles that President Trump hopes they will after the reorganization of our development assistance organizations. Finally, I worked very closely with my Japanese counterparts, particularly on the defense cooperation side in encouraging the Japanese to join us in working on capacity building for the Vietnamese. But we also shared our thoughts on the strategic importance of TPP and close Vietnamese relations, not only with the United States, but with Japan as well.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Great, and I've got an immediate follow-up, but I'm going to go down the line here. Tobias?
Sure.
What about you? How do you see influence and competition in the region?
So I'm going to pick up, well, actually, first, thank you, especially to the hardworking Sasakawa staff. I mean, I get to see how hard everyone works to put this together, and you really, really do a great job. So thanks to them first. I'm going to focus, and I don't want to step on Abe's toes too much, but talk a little bit about, we have 2.5 years left, Abe in his third term as LDP leader and as prime minister, and talk about what we might expect, because I think we can talk about Japan as a player in this competition, for influence in the region. And as we look into his last years in office, I think there's one thing we can say for certain, and that is, as he nears the end of his term, that he'll find less room maybe to pursue domestic policies, and I think increasingly we're going to see activity in foreign policy. I think his ability to move foreign policy will remain strong, even as I think the political calendar is going to make domestic policy maybe not stagnant, but just harder to push forward. So I think we're going to see building on some of the gains that that Maria talked about, where under Prime Minister Abe's leadership during the first 6 years in office, you've seen really a remarkable turn. And what I would argue is that really under Abe's leadership, you've had Japan become really the leader of a middle power bloc in Asia. And I think things were maybe trending this direction for some time, but this became very clear once the US pulled out of TPP and Japan brought it back, that here you have now this mix of economies, maybe for the most part wealthier, say, than the mix in RCEP, but nevertheless countries that have close relationships with the United States in a lot of ways, dependent on security, dependent on the United States for security in a number of ways, but then also have economic relations with China, have deep economic ties with each other, and are interested in that process of rulemaking, which the previous US administration made very clear that it wanted to do, and Japan has picked up that mantle. And there are a lot of assets that come with that. Japan has a presence all over Southeast Asia, I mean, for a number of decades, and I think there's a recognition that Japan's growth is going to come from having a place in the growing markets of Asia and South and Southeast Asia.
そして 政治的な安定性もできてきた世界を見てみてください。かなりのアセットがありまして、でそこに
And as part of that process, you've also had a change, I think, in Japan's domestic institutions so that you have a government that can actually think strategically, I think, really for the first time in decades, and really try to look ahead and think about, okay, what's Japan's place in the region and what can Japan bring to the table? And Japan is admired in ways, that it wants to, that it wants to put its money on the ground in places, that its companies are there, that its aid institutions are there, and that really it can, I think, credibly say that it does not seek domination, that it actually seeks win-win relationships with countries all over the region. And I think all of those assets have enabled it, I think, to push an agenda forward. That being said, I think when you try to look at the next couple of years and you think about, well, okay, Japan's had a busy few years between reviving TPP, or entering TPP, reviving it, articulating an infrastructure strategy, getting the Japan-EU FTA done. It's hard to think, okay, what's the next act? What's left now to push this agenda forward? And there are a few areas, and I think you can see the challenges in each of them. One, I think, is the discussion about TPP expansion. So this discussion's already started happening. You have Thailand expressing interest, possibly maybe Indonesia, maybe the South Koreans. The British have talked about, getting in at some point if they could ever figure out Brexit. Obviously, there are challenges in all of these areas, and you look, Thailand's kind of had its own political uncertainty through elections. Indonesia just came out of an election cycle. Britain, again, who knows? And so you realize that as important as political stability has been for Japan's leadership, and I think giving it an ability to kind of articulate an agenda for these different groupings, it also can't get too far ahead of its partners either. And its partners, in some ways, have to sort out what they want before Japan can really organize the discussion. So I think there's some challenges there with TPP. The same sort of story with RCEP, that RCEP has continued. It's been in the background. Japan claims that they want to bring the process, bring it across the finish line. But again, there's only so much that Japan can do if domestic politics in India, speaking of elections, don't let the Indian government make the kind of compromises it needs to make to get RCEP done. Getting India and China to agree on market access and trade and services liberalization. There are a lot of obstacles there that even if Japan is committed to leading, and even if Japan is stable and able to set the agenda, you can only go so far twisting arms, and people have to be willing to let their arms be twisted, and that, I think, those obstacles are pretty apparent. And then, of course, as Maria said, the challenges with the U.S.-Japan talks, and it seems that Japan is certainly coming into these talks on the defensive, and really the challenge is either A, is there a way to just get this out of the way quickly, as some voices in the United States suggest, or B, is there a way to shift to a bigger vision, something more long-term, more positive, that does shift to the rulemaking question that that really was the focus of TPP. And we've seen, it's worth stressing, I think we've seen some of these discussions going on in a trilateral setting regarding the WTO and upgrading WTO rules between the US, Japan, and the EU. So there is interest, there's an appetite for having those discussions. So the question is, how do you forefront those? How do you not let everything get bogged down by agriculture, by automobiles, and the trade deficit and these issues that everyone's been talking about for a long time, but seem very 20th century and not 21st century. Finally, it's worth just looking ahead and just saying that as Abe comes to the end of his term, whoever follows him, whatever leader kind of emerges from the LDP to follow Abe, are they going to be as committed to this kind of political, this agenda that he's left of Japan as kind of first among equals among Asia's middle powers? Are they going to have the same ability to one, to control domestic interests? I think one of the most amazing transformations Abe has achieved is when you look at Japan entering the TPP talks in 2013 and massive demonstrations by farmers and having to take this kind of hard, strident nationalist line. We're going to defend the national interest. And then by the time it came to revive TPP and then to bring the Japan-EU FTA to a conclusion, it seemed that those interests had been silent. So the question is, does his successor, is he able to press forward with that? Probably, but you need someone who's willing to do it. You need someone who has this vision of Japan going out into the world, recognizing that its future really is in having a firm stake in growth in South and Southeast Asia, and that the government has to put its muscle behind that. And that really is going to be the test going forward for whoever follows him. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Tobias. Again, got a couple of follow-up thoughts. But Nabe, please.
Yeah, thank you. One thing, Matt, I'm still affiliated with CSIS.
Oh, okay. Apologies, I'm out of date.
And
great.
I think one interesting thing is actually that they've already talked about somehow you told Japan more capacity building to the Vietnam and other countries. And I'm from Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan, and we are doing a very interesting project. That is the exchange of Japanese self-defense forces officers and Vietnamese military officers. And I had a chance to talk with Vietnamese military, and they expected a lot to Japanese. And one thing is capacity building, but including, for example, the Vietnamese military, when they are dispatched to the UN-sponsored peacekeeping operation. Japan is really good at the training capacity for the construction and the building. Even Japan actually give a lot over the training. I think that is it's not so visible, but very important things. So what Japan is trying to somehow influence, especially the Southeast Asia and the Asian region. And that is probably some kind of soft and charm competition. So that is one word. And that is traditionally Japan has been working on with Asian neighbors. The famous doctrine in the previous panel, Yuki Tatsumi mentioned the Fukuda doctrine. Fukuda doctrine was in 1977, and I'd like to explain a little bit further. That is clearly the first, Japan will not become military power. And the second, Japan, as a true friend of a country of Southeast Asia, will do its best for the consolidating the relationship of mutual confidence and the trust based on the heart-to-heart understanding. And the third, Japan will be the equal partner of ASEAN and the member countries and cooperate positively with them. And that is behind this one is a history, and also the ASEAN country doesn't want to be forced to choose either US side or China side. They really wanted to pursue their own interest, and if either US, Japan, or China really try force to choose, very counterproductive. That's Japan knew. So what Japan has done is clearly try to make a kind of soft approach and increasing the soft power elements in the economic assistance, even the finance too. Very recently, Prime Minister Abe is, by the way, visiting Europe and visiting Visegrad 4 countries, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech and the Slovakia. That's very important, the competition of soft power, because as you may realize, these East European countries were under heavy influence by the China, especially the technology. So what Japan tried to do is not just the competition, but we try to influence our own way and the soft approach. And probably the 5G, Japan cannot be substitute, but trying to influence them with our own economic assistance. And I think that is the kind of things. And Japan already signed, agreed and signed and ratified, not ratified yet, but it's ratified, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement with EU. And as well as SPA, Strategic Partnership Agreement. SPA is not so visible yet, but very important for Japan cooperate with the EU country, not only with the economic area, but security and the political area. And also, very interesting article I happened to read, a very recent one. You should take a look. The Wall Street Journal, April 23rd. That the article's title is Japan's Silent Belt and Road is Beating China. Despite the fanfare over Chinese investment abroad, Japan is a still higher international creditor. It's true, but that doesn't mean that Japan is a huge, big competitor compared to China. China is still the big influential. But again, the big question is quality rather than quantity. Japan cannot compete with China in quantity, but somehow focusing on the quality, especially with the charm and the soft power. So, but at the same time, again, the quantity is not so bad at current moment, according to the Wall Street Journal. At least the Asian Development Bank, that's not Japan's one, but Japan's leadership with the cooperation with the United States. ADB, Asian Development Bank, now lending money, the 35.8 billion in 2018, up 40% over 2 years. And that's if Chinese led AIIB, I think that's just 6.4 billion. So, and that's not competition. Actually, the President Nakao of ADB is very helpful to the AIIB if standard is okay. So Prime Minister Abe also said, his position is if China's standard is okay, acceptable, I think happy to cooperate. That means that if China's the standard is not okay, we are very reluctant to. So again, shaping China's attitude, shaping China's the economic influence is a really issue. And of course, Japan alone is very limited, but with the cooperation with the United States and other like-minded countries, that is important. So competition to get the heart of Southeast Asian nations. It's a really big issue between Japan and the United States. I'll stop.
Okay, great. I'm realizing after those presentations how huge a topic this is and how little time we have. So I'm going to try to go quickly through a few things. On trade, I want to try to get to the U.S.-Japan talks, to the U.S.-China talks, to TPP, and to RCEP. So hold your breath. Maria, first, on the Japan stuff. So I think I and a lot of other people have been a little skeptical about this process of bilateral trade between the U.S. and Japan, partly because it feels as though this shouldn't be the thing we should be spending most of our time talking about in the alliance in 2019. It feels like there are other things that are more important, some of which have been talked about on this panel. But trying to be the devil's advocate, is there a possibility that this could be a positive thing if it becomes a path to getting some of the rules, as we've all, I think everybody's touched on, these trade agreements, the new ones from Chorus through TPP, through the USMCA for that matter, are about two things. They're about market access and sort of the old issues, and then rulemaking, the new issues. Is there an opportunity to use this agreement to try to nail some of those digital rules and expand those and spread them beyond the U.S. and Japan to other places? And even beyond that, is this a potential path then back for the U.S. to get back to TPP or whatever you want to call it, to a regional high standard agreement at some point in the future? I'm not predicting that in the next 20 months, but at some point, could this be a pathway back? Is this something that potentially could have an upside?
Well, it's challenging times. I think that the United States has been focused on China primarily. Now the attention has reverted to Japan. And the question is, can these talks be productive or destructive? And we're about to learn that in a few months. I think that on a positive side, Minister Motegi was here in Washington last week, and he agreed to introduce the topic of digital economy into the bilateral talks. And I think that's good, precisely because it's one of the arenas where the United States and Japan completely share a vision. They already have negotiated common rules, and it's a matter of how they project them towards other countries, and in particular in the Asia region. I also think it's good because it will likely provide oxygen to negotiations that are going to be in dire need of that. And what I have in mind is precisely what happened in the renegotiation on the NAFTA agreement, where it was all that modernization agenda, bringing back the TPP chapters, that allowed negotiators to continue with the talks when they were hitting the stumbling blocks because of the concern with the trade deficit that the president has, and the pressure on quotas and all those things. When those negotiations were looking ugly, what you could look at was where there was a common interest, and that was the digital economy, the services, and so forth. So I think that opening the scope of the bilateral talks in that way is positive. But let's be realistic. These two countries now, with the Trump administration, have very different trade philosophies motivating them. If you read a joint statement between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump, the differences are transparent. They are there. The president talked about or insisted on introducing language on bilateral trade deficits and rules that would increase investment and jobs in manufacturing in the United States. And what the Japan side insisted on was win-win outcomes and a rules-based negotiation. Secondly, it's not just the trade philosophies that are different, it is what is the most immediate motivation for sitting at the table. Japan now reluctantly agreed to the bilateral talks because it wants to avoid a possible punitive action from the United States, again, that potential auto tariff. And the United States is coming to the table with a sense of urgency because it wants to make sure that its farmers and its producers are not shut out of the Japanese market, because they learned with all of us the big surprise that actually Japan could move on and negotiate ambitious trade agreements without the United States that now create disadvantages. So I think there's a lot of potential if we agree to a grand bargain, in the sense that I think it has to be a win-win for both sides. Japan's sensitive sectors' concerns seem to be factored in, and that means that no tariffs and no quotas on automobiles, and in exchange for that, Japan could then give TPP-level agricultural concessions. But whether those rational calculations will prevail or not is everybody's question, and that's why I think we approach the negotiations with trepidation.
Yeah. Nabe, can I ask you, from a Japanese perspective, whether, what the game plan is, or what Abe thinks is the best path forward in this bilateral trade talks? Is it to try to get a quick deal, to try to get this behind him, or or either because he thinks there might be some strategic opportunity, as I suggested, to maybe get the U.S. to endorse some of the rules and ultimately maybe even rejoin a regional agreement? Is there value from his point of view in sort of having this be a broader and deeper agreement, even if it takes time? What do you think his incentives are?
Mm-hmm. All right. At current moment, probably what the U.S. wants Japan to agree is a more agricultural sector. And in that sense, the Prime Minister Abe was determined to participate in the TPP. That was a huge jump because LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, is supported by the farmers and agricultural corporation. Even the TPP was tough for agriculture. So that's one of the reasons I think already the Prime Minister Motegi already proposed that Japan is ready to agree with the lower tariff level which Japan agreed in the TPP. So that is one thing. And probably Mr. Abe doesn't want making a very negative effect from trading negotiation between Japan and the United States, what happened in the 80s and the 90s. That negative effect is a really negative effect on alliance management. That's clearly Mr. Abe doesn't want. So I believe the somehow the determined to negotiate on a trade issue with the U.S. is a very important and setting somehow the willingness to the working with the U.S. and also eventually maintain the current trade regime. And I think that's my observation.
I see. Okay, lots to ask about that, but let me ask Dave about I still don't, really understand the full reasons for why Vietnam wanted to be in TPP. It is a little counterintuitive, a nominally communist country that has state involvement in the economy pretty extensively, has these other issues that it knew it was going to have to address, as you mentioned, human rights and other things, to get in. Was the logic that this was just so important strategically to be engaged with the U.S.? Was it just access to the U.S. market? Was it they actually wanted this as a tool to drive reform domestically? And the reason I'm still revisiting that question is I'm interested in Vietnam's perspective. Other Southeast Asian countries, are they thinking that way? Are they having the similar conversations? And to what extent does the U.S. being part of this, help? Is that essential to, because it was essential to Vietnam's, participating because of the access to our market and the strategic potential gains. So, what are the chances that this model are going to expand within the region and ultimately to China? Because China also may see, they don't want the strategic alliance maybe with the United States, but they do want, some people in China want the outside force to promote domestic reform. They want access to our market. They want some of the other things that Vietnam may have wanted. So it's still useful to know what was Vietnam's thinking in joining TPP.
Yeah, I think the Vietnamese had three big reasons for wanting to join TPP. The first reason was that they recognized that it would probably produce immediate economic benefits, both in terms of just raw increases in exports, as well as helping Vietnamese producers move up the value chain. I once visited a cut and sew factory outside of Da Nang, where they basically cut up pajamas and sewed the pieces together. And I went to a warehouse full of textiles, and my guide said, all of these textiles come from China. They're all imported from China. Joining TPP would help the Vietnamese start producing textiles, doing other things to move up the value chain, of course bringing big benefits to the Vietnamese economy. The second reason, as you suggested, Matt, was TPP helped those in the Vietnamese elite interested in economic reform move their agenda. The Vietnamese have to do big things to further reform their economy, including equitizing state-owned enterprises, which constitute, I think, still about 40% of the economy. So joining TPP and implementing the kinds of state-owned rules related to state-owned enterprises was in the interests of Vietnamese reformers. And when we pulled out of TPP, the Vietnamese in general felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them, but in particular, the Vietnamese economic reformers felt that the rug had been pulled out from them. A third big reason, as I suggested earlier, was the strategic reason. It just helps Vietnam diversify its trading partners, avoid having to accommodate itself completely to the Chinese economy. And its economic relationship with China is huge. The economic opportunities that China presents Vietnam are huge, and they're going to continue pursuing those, but being in TPP as being in CPTPP now helps the Chinese balance those opportunities. Helps the Vietnamese balance those opportunities.
Yeah. Okay. Tobias, I want to have a round quickly about what people think about the U.S.-China trade talks and the prospects for them, but also kind of how they influence this conversation. I mean, does it matter to Japan how the U.S.-China trade situation comes out? Does it matter to the rest of the region? Does it matter to China's influence and competition with China, how that comes out? And, so, and as I say, just sort of what do you think the prospects are for the U.S.-China talks?
I mean, it certainly looks like we're heading into an end game. And as far as Japan is concerned, I mean, I think the main thing that that they're looking forward to is just the reduction of the uncertainty. That I think your Prime Minister Abe is facing another consumption tax hike later this year, and the fact that there has been a lot of uncertainty generated by, we just don't know how this trade situation is going to resolve. We've seen some spillover effects on Japanese companies, lots of production in China, concerned about the growth outlook there. So anything that can reduce some of the global economic uncertainty, I think, is going to be welcomed in Japan. I think they just, Abe just needs that. It will make the consumption tax decision easier and more manageable. And if you don't have that, I think things will get difficult. So that's the first. I mean, I think then the second, I mean, maybe this is less of a concern for Japan, is just the diversionary effects. And if China starts buying lots of soybeans and other products from the United States, who's going to be paying the cost for that? Who's not going to be selling their products to China? And I think that's certainly Japan and pretty much every other country is going to be watching that closely. And I think third is this question of rulemaking. Is this an agreement that's going to move kind of the ball forward on the field when it comes to encouraging China to make some of the reforms to its industrial policies and its trade policies that there is a consensus that needs to happen, and that is this approach going to do it, or is it going to take a Japan, EU, U.S. approach? Is it going to take maybe even a broader multilateral approach? Is it going to take finding a way to entice China in, whether by strengthening the rule-making provisions of RCEP, which, I mean, that's been something that Japan has started arguing about, over the last couple of years, certainly after it brought back CPTPP. Or
arguing that, you mean importing some of that rules into RCEP.
Strengthening those pieces of RCEP, where you've had a lot of talk about these 20th century market access questions, but should it have more of that? Should it do more to encourage China and really other countries to take some steps forward, on state-owned enterprises and export subsidies and some of these issues? That's obviously something to watch. I mean, I think we don't quite know what the final terms would look like, but if the U.S. could actually get some cracks in that, maybe that creates some possibilities in some of these trade negotiation settings.
Nabe, does RCEP how does Japan reconcile RCEP with TPP? Because they seem like very different approaches, as Tobias was suggesting. RCEP is not very deep. It's or at least it hasn't been. Prospects are not good for it. But is it somehow how can you reconcile? How can Japan reconcile being part of RCEP and being part of the TPP sort of system? Or does it not matter because RCEP's not going anywhere as long as India's in there, which is sort of my view. I mean, in real terms. Or is it going to make a difference? Does Japan think it should? RCEP should make a difference.
You know what? The RCEP was originally the plan in less than RCEP minus India and Australia. That was a very original idea. It's a more China-centric one. But Japan somehow insisted to include many other countries, Australia and India. I think Japan really needed to promote both RCEP and the TPP, and very different level, different idea. And somehow RCEP is relatively easier for the Asian participants to join, and also relatively easier to include China. And it's not so bad things for as long as China continue to play with respecting a common rule throughout the region. So it seems to me Japan really wanted to pursue both. Very different way and different strategic idea. But again, to shape China's behavior, I think RCEP is one very important one. If combined with a TPP, it's good. Like TPP is a more high standard and try to include China eventually, but China is not ready. unfortunately, U.S. don't join the TPP, but still the CPTPP is a kind of attractive framework. UK may be interested in, Thailand may be interested in. So still, I'm sure that Japan try best to pursue both lines of RCEP and TPP.
Okay. I want to have the audience come in a minute, but I do want to do at least one round on Belt and Road. But before I do that, Maria, do you have thoughts on the U.S.-China?
Sure. I mean, I do think that the U.S.-China trade question is the question, and every country has a keen interest, Japan included, on how this plays out. The way I would see it is that Japan shares the end objectives that the United States has vis-a-vis encouraging, promoting Chinese reform. Chinese interventionist industrial policies have imposed a lot of externalities on others. And Japan, I think, would be all for disciplines on state-owned enterprises, transparency and limits on industrial subsidies, the end of forced technology transfers, you name it. So when you identify the problems, I think Japan and the United States see eye to eye. But I do see big disagreements on how you go about encouraging or compelling China to change. And the fact that the United States launched this episode with China through a 301 investigation, I think is problematic for Japan because it's, again, going back to that unilateral path that Japan very much
has some experience with 301, yes.
Yes, very
Not
concerned
happy.
with. So they're not going to, support that effort because, if the United States is going to make itself judge, jury, and executor in any trade dispute, then that creates problems for the other countries in the system. And that's why I think that Japan, as Tobias was making reference to, has launched this trilateral effort with the European Union and the United States on the silence of the WTO to bring about the different type of exercise, and that has to do with the codification of rules, and try to increase the pressure in China, but from a multilateral point of view, and not just a pure bilateral agreement. Of course, Japan cares about uncertainty. Of course, Japan cares about tariffs that target the global supply chain. And we need to wait a couple of weeks, if we're optimistic, perhaps longer, to see what is the content of the US-China trade agreement. But very important, what is going to be the enforcement? Because it might not be a stable equilibrium. If the enforcement is that each side can snap back the tariffs, it could very well be that the agreement unravels quickly.
Okay, again, there's just so much else to talk about. You mentioned just in passing supply chains, and we need to have a conversation about that because there's a lot going on in terms of shifting supply chains as a result of a lot of factors, changes in growth in China, labor costs around the region, countries either taking advantage of or trying to game around these different trade agreements. I mean, there's a lot going on. I encourage you to read up on regional supply chains because it's a very important issue that we didn't have time to touch on. But just on Belt and Road, let me just, or infrastructure, let me just ask, I'm just going to go down the line and ask the same two questions. On the China side, how much love is Belt and Road buying China in the region? I mean, it feels like if I asked this question 2 years ago before their Belt and Road Forum last time or right after it, you'd say, wow, this is really getting people's attention. It's getting China a lot of kudos and credit and influence in the region. Going into this thing on Thursday, Friday this week, charitably known as BARF2, the Belt and Road Forum 2, that it feels very different, that China's not having quite as much luck with Belt and Road as they thought. Do people agree with that? And sort of how do you characterize China's success or otherwise with this strategy? And then the other question is about the U.S. I mean, there are people who think, we just launched a big report yesterday with Charlene Barshevsky and Steve Hadley, did a task force on global infrastructure, and we made a strong case for the U.S. to have a strategy and to engage and to step up and be in this game. But, devil's advocates would say, what does the U.S. have to offer in this game? And, this is not really our comparative advantage, and, why should we be trying to do this? Is there a U.S. play in this game, and what are our comparative advantages? So if I could just maybe start with Nabe and come back down the other line. What do you think about China, Belt and Road? How much luck are they having with that? And, what should the U.S. do in this area?
Okay, I already talked about somehow ADB, Asian Development Bank, leadership of Japan and the U.S. is somehow the good record of in the past assisting to the regional infrastructure making. And China is now trying to join. And approach is not exclude China, but making some best combination, as long as China follow the the standards. And of course, Belt and Road is the kind of a very scary, some kind of China domination. So it's really up to the China's behavior. If people are afraid of China try to take over their own some property or any the leadership, I think it's not successful. If everybody in the region really appreciated the China's leadership, maybe successful, and the China's behavior would be shaped in what we really wanted to do. That is my sense.
And the U.S., what should the U.S. be doing in this game? Should it be doing more with Japan, or does it have something else to offer?
Of course, U.S. has been very helpful, taking a leadership. And but at current moment, probably the ADB is one of arena, and also U.S. has their own defense engagement. That's capacity building to the military and the security sector in the region. That's huge, actually.
Let me say, just to pick up on the quickly editorial comment, and you mentioned capacity building a couple times, and I just want to say, first of all, Japan does do it very well. When I was in Myanmar last year and we went to the development ministry, there was a Japanese, a JICA guy wearing a sarong, and handed his card over, who's embedded in the ministry there, helping train. That's really powerful, and the U.S. should be doing more of that. But to the U.S. credit, I saw this story last week, I think in the Wall Street Journal, about a sort of SWAT team of lawyers and economists that was being dropped in by USAID to Myanmar to help the procurement officers and others in Myanmar ask the right questions when a Chinese group would come up and say, we can build you something cheap and quick, to help train them. That seems to me a useful little nugget there, and something that we should, a seed that we should try to grow, in my view, for what it's worth. Tobias, how would you answer those two questions?
So I realize we're standing between everyone and lunch, so I'm going to be quick. So to the first, obviously, depending on the recipient country, you're seeing, the politics of Chinese lending is complicated. But after a certain point, money talks, and there's a lot of need for it across the region, and it's going to be a factor, and it's going to be part of the picture. So yes, you're going to see countries that maybe go back and forth on projects like what we've seen in Malaysia. But China is going to be a factor in lending in these countries and building things. And certainly then, to answer the second question, there's an interest for Japan and the United States and Australia to try to shape that lending as it can. And I think that's a great example of certainly a kind of thing that can be done. That how do you make China's practices better? Japan, I think, making recognizing that there's opportunities for Japanese and Chinese companies and the Japanese and Chinese governments to cooperate when it comes to building projects, if you can raise the standards and do it according to Japan's quality infrastructure standards. I mean, I think that is great. And I think the way Japan has approached that has been astute. And I think it's really the process of China sort of wooing Japan into the Belt and Road has, I think, been illustrative of Japan's, what Japan brings to the table. That Japan has a good reputation, has good relationships. It does have money. It can still bring that money to the table. Its companies have those supply chains all throughout the region and a lot of expertise. That's, you can understand why China would want Japan's imprimatur on this and why China might want to reach Japan's standards. So as far as the U.S. goes, I mean, the U.S. does not necessarily bring the same assets to the table in the region that Japan does. Oftentimes, the U.S. is demanding things that Japan doesn't really care to. The U.S. carries a lot of baggage. I mean, I think the Japan-India relationship contrasted with the U.S.-India relationship is a great example of, Japan can kind of get along better with India because it certainly hasn't demanded as much of India or sort of imposed onerous conditions on various issues. And so, I mean, Japan, I think, is prepared to lead on this issue, and the U.S. really should be in a position of what can we do to help you and support you on this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave.
I'm going to start by talking about strategy, American regional strategy, and I'll get to the BRI in a minute. I've always advocated, or for some time I've advocated thinking about the Indo-Pacific region as a single strategic theater. But I think it's also important to look at the differences between the American strategic position in the subregions. If you look at Northeast Asia, it's international relations defined in part by a military confrontation across the 38th parallel. We have lots of forward deployed forces. We have very strong, capable allies. We know pretty much what we go to war for in Northeast Asia. Very different in Southeast Asia. No big military confrontations in Southeast Asia. We have few forward deployed forces, weaker, less reliable allies, and it's not always clear why we go to war in Southeast Asia. Indian Ocean, also very different. Perhaps our position is more diffuse in the Indian Ocean than it is in Southeast Asia. So this makes diplomacy in Southeast Asia, this makes diplomacy not just backed by military force important, it makes diplomacy backed by economic force very important. And I've always seen the BRI as, I agree with Tobias that in the end money talks. The Chinese, no matter how awkward Chinese development assistance efforts are, no matter how predatory their lending practices may be, their money will talk over time and they'll probably figure it out. And that raises the importance of U.S. economic cooperation in the region. It raises the importance of Japan-U.S. cooperation in the economic sphere in the region. I think it's interesting to see how the Chinese message the level of their economic influence and BRI throughout the region. In Beijing, you have Xi Jinping talking about a community of common destiny. You have him talking about establishing an alternative security structure in the region and dumping on American alliances by saying these are obsolete Cold War relics. Xi Jinping's diplomats are operationalizing that approach in the regional level, basically by saying things like, they don't say this exactly, but saying things like, and some of you have heard me say this before, the United States is the old business model, China's the new business model. The US is Blockbuster Video, we're Netflix. You go with the United States, what do you get? Aircraft carrier visits. With China, what do you get? You get wealthy. That's what they're messaging throughout the region. And we have to devise not only a strategy based on substantive economic engagement, increased engagement, but based on messaging that can counter that sort of Chinese approach.
Okay, thanks. Maria?
So very briefly, because we want to bring the audience, in answering this question about China, the Belt Road Initiative, and the U.S. role, I'll just tie in with how we started the conversation. And I made the point that the landscape is shifting very rapidly, and I think this is very true. We went from a narrative where China looked unstoppable with Belt and Road Initiative to the whole project was falling apart because of backlash, and I think that the reality is that neither one is correct. It's a more gray area, and China is adjusting its program, and also local countries are responding in different ways. And if you want to enable the recipients of these Belt and Road projects to derive better terms, what you have to do is to put more competition on the table, and this brings the economist understanding of competition. More supply, more offers, more projects, more sources of credit. And I think that's where the US role is very much needed. Certainly Japan is already there. Now, you know, I think that there's a lot of potential for a US-Japan partnership, but in here I'm going to agree with President Trump. I think I've been more critical of his economic policies so far in my interventions, just in this sense that, you know, memorandum of understanding may be a binding contract, but does not inspire, right? So the US-Japan conversation about infrastructure finance is all about memorandum of understanding. What I would like to see is to elevate this to a vision. And I think it's also very important to think strategically, carefully, what that first pilot project is going to be, because that's your calling card. When the US and Japan or Australia and India come to the region and say, this is what we believe is a shared project, this is what we stand for. And I haven't seen that yet. And I want to then highlight, I think the report that you put together is very, very important. And you make the case that the United States has a role to play. And I would add to that, because this is one area where the United States can have a positive message to the region. And we can leave the trade deficit discussion out the room, shut the door on that, and have a conversation about how these projects benefit both ends, both parties. But my question to you, and I know that panelists should not ask questions to the moderators.
That's right, I'm not paid for that.
Is excellent report. Now, how, and I know that Japan, when they talk about the vision on infrastructure finance, quality infrastructure, what would be the US term? It would be quality infrastructure, and they're just tagging into the Japanese vision, or is there any other word that you think would convey the message of
I think
what
even Japan has backed a little away from quality infrastructure. I mean, it's sort of embedded in their title, their partnership, but I think they're trying not to say it quite as visibly, although, as Mike said in the last panel, the Chinese have adopted that for their forum this week, so maybe that's a good reason to move away from it. But I would say there was a talk about best value infrastructure at one point. I don't think it really matters as long as we're getting to the point that we're going to provide solutions to real economic development challenges that embed good products and services with rule of law, without corruption, with social and environmental safeguards attached. And that's what U.S. and Japan are bringing to the table. That may cost a little more in the short term, but over the life cycle of this infrastructure, it's a more economical proposition as well as beneficial in other ways. So it's hard without a bumper sticker, but I think it's probably better not to say quality infrastructure quite so baldly now, because it gets people's backs up. And by the way, I mean, apart from China, the other problem is it gives people the idea it's expensive. It's very expensive. And so, we don't want a Lexus, we want a Corolla for now, or a Camry. And so we need to, I think, tack to that demand signal as well from the region. Anyway, my clock tells me I've got 6 minutes and 11 seconds, which is enough time for maybe 2 or 3 questions if we can cluster them really quickly. I know everybody wants to get lunch, but I want to give you a chance if you've got a burning question. So if you do, raise your hand, and I think a mic will appear magically. We've answered everything? Or is there somebody way in the back? Or there's somebody there, and I thought I saw a hand way in the back. Yes, that gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Giulio Pugliese, King's College London. I have a question for either of the speakers. What role, if any role, can Europe play in terms of triangulating in connectivity projects, raising the standards, or really shaping the Belt and Road Initiative? And how different is Europe's predicament with the United States from Japan's in terms also of the US chipping in with unilateral tariffs on this and that? Thank you.
Okay, does anybody want to take on Europe? Europe. Or I'll tell you what, actually, let me just, as I said, is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? And feel free, I don't mean to scare you off, but you obviously want lunch, I can tell. Okay, so whoever was in the back was not signaling to ask a question. Okay, let's take on Europe.
Can I?
Go ahead.
All right. I think clearly Japan expect European country, each countries and also EU both to maintain the public goods in the Indo-Pacific region. And clearly several countries are interested in specifically what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. But as a general, I think somehow the Chinese influence over the European countries is sometimes very afraid of by the Japan. I think somehow coordination between EU, European country, and Japan and the United States is a very important one. The visible one is, I think, export of the weapons to China. Well, that was a visible one. And but probably related to this subject is, for example, creating some common ground for the the assistance to the development. And the EU and the European countries are somehow advanced in giving economic assistance to development. I think sharing this standards is very important with Japan and the United States.
I can
Go
offer
ahead.
a comment on the trade part of the question. I think that Japan and the European Union have come closer in light of the unilateral turn in U.S. trade policy. They're both concerned with rising protectionism, with unilateral tariffs, and I think that that was a very large motivation for they finally wrapping up their trade negotiations. The Japan-EU trade agreement had taken a long time. We know that Japan had given priority to the TPP. Only for TPP a special headquarters was created. The negotiations with the EU were not placed at that same level of priority, but that quickly changed. And I think that in the statements of European leaders and Prime Minister Abe, there's always this reference that this trade agreement now has new meaning because it's about making a stand for economic multilateralism, for free trade. We continue to believe in free trade. But there are also very important differences on how they're positioning themselves vis-a-vis the 232 tariffs and the potential bilateral trade negotiations. So the Europeans, I think, have taken a tougher line. They certainly retaliated right away when the steel tariffs and the metal tariffs materialized. And also when they're approaching the negotiation with the United States, they have insisted adamantly that agriculture is off limits. Japan has played it differently. Japan took the hit, did not respond to the metal tariffs. Some of us thought that maybe it's problematic to be a soft target when there's a bully around, but that's a discussion to be, a decision to be discussed. But nevertheless, Japan has decided to try to have a more constructive, I think, negotiation with the United States and is prepared to talk about agriculture. At the end of the day, we have a great social science experiment to see which tactic make work better. We'll have to see.
My own answer would be I think Europe has an important role to play in a way that Nabe mentioned. I mean, I think that helping to promote higher standards and good rules and norms in the region is an important role for Europe to play. Historically, or when I say historically, over the last few decades, Europe hasn't been that engaged in that debate in Asia, but it seems to be much more involved, much more interested in that. And meanwhile, in Europe, it feels there's a pretty fluid debate going on about China right now. 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed that China was this golden, pot at the end of the rainbow that everybody was trying to get their hands in. I think the view has really shifted quite a bit in Europe about China, and people, I think, see the risks as well as the opportunity more than they did. That's certainly true in Germany. And even in Central and Eastern Europe, interestingly, this is this group of countries, the 16 plus 1, 16 East European countries and China, that just had a forum, which, by the way, was in Croatia. And the Croatian Prime Minister, I was reading on my way over here, I think has arrived in Beijing for the Belt and Road Forum, and he made a statement about, China needs to, to follow EU rules and norms and in how it approaches Europe, and that was, to me, striking that even the Croatians have realized that maybe there's a bit of you're buying more than just cheap infrastructure when you deal with China, and you need to, they're a little more cautious than they were, I think, a couple of years ago. So there's a debate happening there, and I think that's constructive, and hopefully Europe will come to the table with something to offer. Okay, no, I'm over 24 seconds, sorry. So with that, I think we will have to wrap up so you can have lunch, but please join me in thanking the panel for a terrific set of contributions. Thank you. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to announce this or you're going to go ahead and announce it. Okay, great. Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next segment will be a conversation between Admiral Blair and our special guest, Dr. Yoichi Funabashi. We're going to this is essentially a working lunch, so we're going to eat our lunches here. We're going to take a short break for you to pick up your box lunches, which are on the right side of the room in the rear. Also, the line might get long there, so you could also go down the hall till you see the Sasakawa USA banner. There are also some lunches in the Peacock Lounge. Speaking of the Peacock Lounge, if you need a little more room to spread out and eat your lunch, you could eat in there. There are about 50 seats in there. I do want to warn you, though, right now the sound is not very good in there. There's not a separate speaker, so you'd have to be fairly quiet, I think, to hear. And we will start here again at 12:30. Thank you.